There's a house in my neighborhood that no one talks about. It isn't abandoned. It isn't haunted, at least not in the way stories usually mean when they say that. It's just quiet. Too quiet. The kind of house you pass every day without ever noticing, even though it's right there, sitting between the yellow colonial with the flower boxes and the brick bungalow with the peeling shutters. I've lived here for 10 years, and I swear, I couldn't tell you what color the siding is. The light hits it differently every time you look. Sometimes gray, sometimes beige, sometimes a pale, washed-out blue. But it never looks quite real. The family who lives there, I think their last name is either Meadows or Monroe, though nobody's sure, are the same way. They come and go like shadows, slipping in and out of the front door at odd hours. Their faces always slightly turned away, their bodies always angled just enough to avoid being seen. I've only heard their voices once, muffled through the thin air of an autumn evening, and even then, they sounded too soft, like someone humming a song they were halfway through forgetting. I wasn't supposed to notice the house. Nobody does. But a few months ago, I made the mistake of walking my dog past it late at night. My usual route was blocked by roadwork, so I had to take the long way home, weaving through streets I normally didn't bother with. The dog, an old golden retriever named Bowie, was sniffing his way along the curb when we passed the house. He stopped dead in his tracks, ears perked, his body frozen in that tight, alert stance dogs get when they sense something out of place. At first, I didn't see what had spooked him. The house looked as blank and unremarkable as ever, its windows dark, its lawn overgrown just enough to blend in with the rest of the neighborhood. But then I noticed the curtain in the upstairs window. It moved. Not the casual flutter of fabric stirred by a breeze, but a deliberate shift, like someone was standing behind it, pulling it aside to look down at us. I stared at the window for what felt like too long. Whoever, or whatever, was behind the curtain didn't move again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My chest tightened, and I tugged Bowie's leash, muttering something about how we'd taken the wrong street. The words felt flat and heavy in my mouth, like they didn't quite belong to me. That night, I dreamed of the house. Or maybe I didn't. Maybe I just thought I did. In the dream, or the memory, I was standing in front of it again, staring up at the blank, shadowed windows. The front door was open. Not wide open, just a crack, enough to show the thin slice of darkness waiting on the other side. I wanted to leave, to turn around and walk away, but my legs wouldn't move. The door creaked wider, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. Just a shape, undefined and shifting, like smoke curling into itself. When I woke up, the dream clung to me, heavy and damp, like I'd been swimming in it all night. I couldn't shake it. All day, I kept glancing out my window, half expecting to see the house staring back at me. It didn't, of course. That would have been too simple, too easy to explain. I told myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, a half-formed memory twisted by an overactive imagination. I had work to do, groceries to buy, emails to answer. The house didn't matter, but it did. It stayed in the back of my mind, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, until one evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I went back. It was raining, one of those soft, endless drizzles that makes everything feel muted and far away. The house looked the same as always, its colors shifting subtly in the dim light. I stood on the sidewalk, staring up at it, trying to convince myself to turn around and go home. But the front gate was open, just a little. Not enough to seem suspicious, but enough to feel like an invitation. I stepped through. The air was thicker inside the gate, heavy with the smell of wet grass and something metallic. The porch creaked under my weight as I climbed the steps. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, and for a moment, I thought I heard something on the other side. A faint rustling, like leaves being blown across a stone floor. The door wasn't locked. It swung open easily, almost too easily, and the darkness inside seemed to pour out, wrapping itself around me. I stepped across the threshold, and the door closed behind me with a soft click. The house was quiet, not just the absence of sound, but an oppressive stillness, like the air itself had been drained of movement. The walls were bare, the floors scuffed and uneven, and the faint smell of something stale lingered in the corners. It didn't feel abandoned, but it didn't feel lived in, either. It felt paused, like a photograph waiting for someone to step back into the frame. I wandered through the rooms, my footsteps muffled by the heavy silence. The furniture was sparse and outdated. An old sofa with fraying upholstery, a coffee table covered in dust, a lamp with no bulb. Everything looked untouched, as if it had been sitting there for decades, waiting for someone to notice it. Then I heard it, a faint sound, coming from somewhere upstairs. Not a voice, not footsteps, just a soft, rhythmic tapping, like a branch tapping against a window pane. I should have left. I should have turned around and walked out the door, gone home, and pretended I'd never been there. But the tapping drew me in, pulling me up the staircase, one creaking step at a time. The sound led me to a door at the end of the hallway. It was smaller than the others, its paint peeling around the edges, and as I reached for the handle, the tapping stopped. The door opened easily, revealing a room that didn't make sense. It was small and square, the walls painted a pale, sickly green. In the center of the room was a chair, an old wooden thing with a high back and a cracked seat. Sitting in the chair was a mirror. The mirror was oval, its frame ornate and tarnished, and its surface was wrong. It didn't reflect the room or me or anything else. It was just empty. I stepped closer, the air growing colder with every step. The emptiness in the mirror seemed to pulse, drawing me in, and as I reached out to touch it, I saw something move. A face. Not mine, not anyone's. Just a suggestion of features. Eyes, a mouth, the curve of a cheek, emerging from the emptiness like a shape rising out of water. I stumbled back, the chair creaking as the mirror tipped forward. The face turned toward me, its eyes locking onto mine, and in that moment, I felt something crack. Not in the mirror, but in me. I don't remember leaving the house. One moment I was staring at the face, and the next, I was standing on the sidewalk, the rain soaking through my clothes. The house was dark again, its windows blank and empty. I haven't gone back. I won't. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and my reflection stares back at me from the bathroom mirror, I think I see it. The faint outline of a face that isn't mine, watching, waiting, smiling. The day I bought the jar of marbles, I wasn't thinking about anything profound. I wasn't even supposed to be at the flea market. It had been one of those gray, overcast mornings where my only plans were to get groceries and maybe catch up on laundry. But when I passed the outdoor stalls on my way back from the store, something tugged at me, an invisible thread pulling me toward the rows of tents sagging under the weight of old junk and stranger treasures. I didn't need anything, but something about the way the vendors haggled with their hands, more than their voices, and the smell of kettle corn swirling through the damp air made me turn into the parking lot without thinking. The jar was sitting on a collapsible table alongside a chaotic assortment of knickknacks. Wooden picture frames with the glass missing, chipped porcelain dogs, a stack of Reader's Digest magazines tied with fraying twine. It was small and squat, the kind of jar you'd keep flour or sugar in if you didn't mind constantly refilling it. But instead of baking supplies, it was filled to the brim with marbles, their colors muted by a thin film of dust. They weren't the smooth, perfect kind I remembered from childhood. These were worn, nicked at the edges like they'd been rolled across 100 sidewalks and driveways. Some were cloudy, their patterns faded, while others gleamed faintly in the dim light, like drops of stained glass. I don't know why I stopped. It wasn't like I had any particular love for marbles. I hadn't seen one in years, much less thought about them. But the jar caught my eye in a way I couldn't explain. It was heavy when I picked it up, the weight of it solid and comforting in my hands. The vendor, an older woman with a gray braid and a voice like crushed gravel, noticed my interest. $5, she said without looking up from the crossword puzzle she was working on. I hesitated, not because of the price, but because I wasn't sure what I'd do with it. The jar didn't belong in my life of emails and late-night takeout. But before I could put it down, my fingers tightened around the lid. "I'll take it," I heard myself say, surprising even myself. At home, the jar looked out of place on my kitchen counter, sitting between a half-empty bottle of olive oil and a stack of unopened mail. I wiped off the dust and unscrewed the lid, tilting it slightly so the marbles rolled against the glass with a faint clinking sound. I reached in and pulled out the first one my fingers found. It was small, mostly green with a swirl of yellow running through it. I held it up to the light, turning it slowly between my thumb and forefinger. Something about the weight of it, the cool smoothness, made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. A memory stirred, faint and far off, like a song you hear on the edge of sleep. I set the marble down and pulled out another, then another, each one feeling heavier than it had any right to be. By the time I reached the bottom of the jar, the memory had taken shape. I was 7 years old, crouched in the dirt behind my old elementary school. A circle of marbles spread out before me. It was recess, and I'd been roped into a game I didn't fully understand. The boy across from me, a lanky kid named Derek, had been explaining the rules in rapid-fire bursts while I nodded along, pretending to keep up. You had to flick one marble at the others, trying to knock them out of the circle without letting your own get trapped. Derek had a small, chipped blue marble that he called his lucky shooter. He swore it had never lost a game. I didn't have a lucky shooter. I'd borrowed my marbles from my older cousin, a small bag she'd shoved into my hands that morning without explanation. Most of them were scratched and dull, but one stood out, a large red marble with a swirling pattern that looked almost alive. It felt powerful in my hand, heavier than the others, and I remember gripping it tightly as Derek lined up his shot. His blue marble hit mine with a sharp clink, sending it spinning across the circle. "Tough break," he said with a grin, scooping up the marbles he'd won. But the thing is, I didn't feel the sting of loss. Instead, I was fascinated by the way the marbles moved, the satisfying weight of them, the way each one seemed to hold a little world inside it. I spent the rest of recess practicing shots on my own, ignoring Derek's teasing. By the time the bell rang, I'd managed to knock 3 marbles out of the circle in a single turn. It felt like magic. The jar on my counter looked smaller now, its contents spread out before me like a constellation of tiny planets. I turned each marble over in my hands, letting the memories trickle back one by one. I remembered the way the sun had glinted off the glass that day behind the school, the sound of Derek's laugh as he claimed my red marble, the gritty feel of dirt under my fingernails. I remembered how my cousin had teased me for losing her favorite one, but eventually let me keep the rest of the bag. The marbles weren't just marbles anymore. They were a reminder of something I'd lost somewhere along the way. The simple joy of holding something small and perfect, of letting yourself get lost in the details, of caring about something for no other reason than it was beautiful. I hadn't felt that in years. My days were filled with spreadsheets and deadlines, texts that went unanswered because I was too tired to respond. When had I stopped noticing the little things? I spent the rest of the evening with the marbles, sorting them into piles by color and size, arranging them into patterns on the counter. It felt ridiculous, childish even, but I couldn't stop. Each marble seemed to hold a story, a fragment of someone else's life. Who had owned them before me? Had they been part of some epic game in a backyard long ago? Had they been carried in a pocket, rolled across a desk, traded for a candy bar? I wondered if the person who'd sold the jar even knew where it had come from, or if it had simply been one more item passed along in the endless shuffle of things we leave behind. When I finally went to bed, I left the marbles out on the counter. I didn't want to hide them away again. Not yet. That night, I dreamed I was back on that dirt playground, crouched in the circle with Derek and his lucky blue marble. But this time, when I took my shot, my red marble hit the others dead center, scattering them like stars across the ground. Derek's jaw dropped and I laughed, the sound bright and full, echoing across the schoolyard. The next morning, I slipped one of the marbles, a small green one with a faint crack down the middle, into my pocket before I left for work. It felt like carrying a tiny piece of that dream with me, a reminder to look for the small joys hiding in plain sight. Throughout the day, I found myself reaching into my pocket, rolling the marble between my fingers during meetings and coffee breaks. It was grounding, in a way I didn't expect. I don't know what I'll do with the rest of the jar. Maybe I'll keep it as it is, a monument to the little things we forget to notice. Or maybe I'll leave the marbles in random places, on a park bench, in the crook of a tree, under a seat on the train, so someone else might stumble across them and feel that same spark of recognition. Have you ever found something so small, so seemingly insignificant, that it cracked open a door to a part of yourself you'd forgotten existed? Something that reminded you of the simple, quiet magic of the world? The train wasn't on any schedule I'd ever seen. I'd been wandering the city after dark, restless in the way that only happens when your brain is too full of thoughts you can't pin down. The night had swallowed most of the noise by then. Shops closing their shutters, buses sighing into their final stops, streetlights humming to life one by one like stars coming awake. I wasn't walking anywhere in particular, just moving for the sake of it, the rhythm of my footsteps filling the hollow spaces in my mind. That's when I saw the station. It wasn't new, but I'd never noticed it before. It sat at the end of a narrow alley, tucked between two buildings whose walls leaned toward each other like they were sharing secrets. The entrance was marked by a single wrought iron archway. The word Stillwell curved across the top in faded gold letters. I paused, staring at it. I knew this part of town. I'd walked this street dozens of times. I'd never seen a station here. But there it was, quiet and waiting. The faint scent of damp stone wafting up from the stairs that led underground. I should have kept walking. I don't know why I didn't. Something about the place felt expectant, as though it had been waiting for someone to find it. Or maybe just for me. I stepped under the archway and descended the stairs. The platform was deserted, though it looked as though it had been used recently. The tiles underfoot were cracked but swept clean, and the benches lining the walls had worn cushions that bore the faint imprint of people sitting there. A single train track ran through the station, flanked by old-fashioned gas lamps that flickered unevenly, their flames casting long, jittery shadows. The air was cool and heavy, the kind of damp that clung to your skin. There was no schedule posted on the walls, no map, no sign to indicate where the trains went. Only a small wooden kiosk sat near the edge of the platform, manned by a figure I hadn't noticed at first. They were wearing a faded navy uniform, the kind you'd expect a station attendant to wear, though it looked a few decades out of style. Their face was obscured by the brim of their cap, but I could tell they were watching me. "Evening," they said, their voice low and even. "Looking for a ride?" I hesitated. "Where does it go?" They tipped their heads slightly, a movement that might have been amusement or impatience. "Depends on where you need to be." It wasn't the answer I wanted, but before I could press further, a sound filled the air. A low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and then the train arrived. It didn't pull into the station so much as glide, silent and smooth, like a shadow sliding across the wall. The cars were sleek and black, their windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. There were no markings, no numbers, no indication of a destination. Just a single door sliding open with a hiss, revealing a faint golden light spilling out from within. "Your train," the attendant said. I hesitated again, my pulse quickening. I didn't buy a ticket. They smiled, or at least I think they did. Their face was still shadowed, but something about their posture shifted, like they were holding back a laugh. "You already paid," they said. "You wouldn't be here otherwise." I didn't know what that meant, but something about the way they said it sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced at the open door, then back at the attendant. "Where does it go?" I asked again. Their smile widened. This time, I was sure of it. Only one way to find out. The rational part of me was screaming to turn around, to walk back up those stairs and leave this strange, impossible station behind. But another part of me, deeper and quieter, was curious. I couldn't explain it, but something about the train felt familiar, like hearing a song you haven't thought about in years, but somehow still know the words to. So I stepped inside. The door slid shut behind me with a soft click, and the train began to move almost immediately, the motion so smooth I barely felt it. The interior was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of the usual rows of seats, the car was lined with small compartments, each separated by glass walls that gave me a glimpse of what was inside. In the first compartment, a man sat at a table, staring at a clock that didn't seem to be working. The hands were spinning wildly, faster than they should have been, but the man didn't seem to notice. He just kept tapping his fingers on the table in a slow, deliberate rhythm, his eyes fixed on the clock as though it held some kind of answer. The next compartment was empty, except for a single wooden chair sitting in the middle of the floor. On the chair sat a notebook, its pages fluttering as though caught in a breeze. though there was no wind. I moved further down the car, peering into each compartment as I passed. In one, a child was playing with a set of blocks, stacking them into impossible shapes that defied gravity. In another, a woman was combing her hair in front of a mirror, though her reflection didn't match her movements. She'd lift the comb, and her reflection would smile instead, its teeth sharp and gleaming. None of them acknowledged me. They didn't even seem aware of my presence, as though I was looking through a window into another world. Or maybe they were the ones looking at me. Finally, I reached the end of the car, where a single seat faced a wide window. I sat down, unsure of what else to do, and stared out into the darkness. At first, there was nothing to see, just endless black, broken only by the occasional flash of light as we passed something. Trees, maybe, or shadows of trees. Then the landscape began to shift. Shapes emerged from the darkness, faint outlines of buildings, streets, rivers. It looked like a city, but not one I recognized. The architecture was wrong, too old and too new at the same time, as though pieces of it had been pulled from different eras and stitched together without thought. And then I saw the people. They were walking through the streets, their movements strange and disjointed, like marionettes being jerked along by invisible strings. Some of them paused to look up at the train as it passed, their faces blank but their eyes sharp, too sharp, as though they could see straight through the glass and into me. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Something about their gaze held me there, pinned in place. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the city vanished, swallowed by the dark. The train slowed. The door behind me slid open, and I turned to see the attendants standing there, their caps still low over their face. "End of the line," they said. I didn't understand. The train hadn't stopped, and there was no station in sight. "But you've seen what you needed to see," they interrupted. "The rest is up to you." I tried to ask what they meant, but before I could, they stepped aside, revealing a door that hadn't been there before. It led out into the dark, the faint glow of something distant, something waiting, just visible in the void beyond. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. "Go on," the attendant said, their voice softer now, almost kind. "You've already paid." I stepped through. The elevator in my building is older than I am. It's one of those creaky, slightly ominous contraptions with a panel of buttons that looks like it was designed for a spaceship from a 1970s sci-fi movie. Half the lights don't work, and when you press a button, there's a moment of hesitation, like the whole thing is deciding whether or not it's worth the effort. Sometimes it hums. Other times it groans. Occasionally, it makes a noise that sounds suspiciously like a sigh. I like to think it has a personality, not a good one, mind you, but a personality nonetheless. I've never trusted it. Still, I use it almost every day. It's an unspoken agreement. It takes me to my floor, and in return, I ignore the uneasy feeling that one day it might give up halfway and trap me between the 5th and 6th floors. This morning, though, something strange happened. I stepped into the elevator as usual, coffee in one hand and grocery bag in the other, and hit the button for the 8th floor. The doors slid shut with their usual reluctant clunk, and the elevator jolted into motion. But instead of the smoothish ride I'd come to expect, there was a loud thunk followed by a lurch, and then nothing. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging me into darkness. The elevator stopped moving. I stood there for a moment, stunned, the air thick with the smell of burnt metal and, somehow, regret. I think it's important to note that my first thought wasn't panic. It wasn't even fear. It was, of course. Because, of course, on a day when I just bought a carton of eggs and planned to do absolutely nothing, the universe decided to trap me in a metal box. I fumbled for my phone, the light from the screen casting eerie shadows on the walls, and hit the emergency button. Nothing happened. I pressed it again, harder this time, as if the elevator might respond to brute force. Still nothing. That's when the reality of my situation began to sink in. I was stuck. In the elevator. Alone. I glanced at the grocery bag at my feet and silently thanked my past self for buying snacks. At least I wouldn't starve. I leaned against the wall and slid down until I was sitting on the floor, trying to figure out how long I could last before I completely lost my mind. The thing about being trapped in an elevator is that it's not immediately terrifying. It's annoying, sure, and a little unsettling, but it's not the kind of panic-inducing event they make movies about. At least, not at first. For the first few minutes, I just sat there, scrolling through my phone, hoping for a signal. No luck. The elevator, it seemed, was also a Faraday cage. I could still hear the faint hum of the building around me, pipes groaning, distant footsteps, the occasional muffled bark of someone's dog. But inside the elevator, it was oppressively quiet. The kind of quiet that amplifies every little sound. The rustle of my jacket, the creak of the floor when I shifted my weight, the soft tapping of my foot against the metal wall. At some point, I realized I was talking to myself. Not full conversations, exactly, but little comments here and there. Well, this is fun. Guess I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. I hope the eggs don't go bad. It's funny how quickly you start narrating your own life when there's no one else around to fill the silence. I'd always thought of myself as someone who didn't mind being alone. I like quiet mornings, solo walks, the occasional weekend spent in pajamas with a book and no obligations. But this was different. This wasn't solitude by choice. It was enforced, involuntary. There was no exit, no escape hatch, no way to decide, okay, I've had enough of this. Time to leave. I don't know how long I sat there before I started thinking about the elevator itself. I'd always treated it like a necessary evil, something to be tolerated but not appreciated. But now, stuck inside it, I couldn't help but notice its quirks. The scratched-up walls, the faint graffiti someone had carved into the metal paneling, the way the floor felt slightly sticky no matter how recently it had been cleaned. I started imagining all the people who had been in this elevator before me. Their lives, their stories. The woman on the second floor who always smells like lavender. The guy from the fifth floor who listens to podcasts at full volume. The elderly couple who argue in whispers, as if the elevator might eavesdrop. All of us, crammed into this tiny, creaking box at different times, all depending on it to carry us up or down. I thought about the time I got stuck in a different elevator, years ago, with a stranger. It had been a much shorter ordeal, maybe 15 minutes, tops, but those 15 minutes felt like an eternity. The stranger and I had tried to make small talk, but it quickly devolved into awkward silence. I'd never even learned his name. When the doors finally opened, we nodded at each other and went our separate ways, never to meet again. I wondered if he remembered it. I wondered if he told the story to his friends, or if he'd forgotten it entirely. I hadn't forgotten. There was something about that shared moment, as uncomfortable as it was, that had stayed with me. The sound of my stomach growling pulled me out of my thoughts. I reached into the grocery bag and pulled out a granola bar. As I ate, I started to notice something strange. The air felt different. Heavier, maybe, or quieter. It was as if the elevator itself was listening, waiting for me to do something. For a moment, I wondered if I'd gone completely mad. I mean, who feels watched by an inanimate object? But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger. I found myself whispering, as if speaking too loudly might wake something up. Okay, I get it, I said, not really knowing what I was addressing. You've got my attention. And then, as if on cue, the elevator shuddered. The lights flickered back on, and I felt a jolt as it started moving again. Just like that, the spell was broken. The doors opened on the 8th floor, and I stepped out into the hallway, my legs shaky but functional. I glanced back at the elevator, half expecting it to close its doors and vanish forever. But it just sat there, humming quietly, waiting for its next passenger. I don't know what happened in there. Maybe it was just a technical glitch. Maybe I let my imagination get the best of me. But as I walked to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that the elevator had been trying to tell me something. Not in words, exactly, but in its own strange, mechanical way. It's not something I can explain, or even fully understand. All I know is that I don't look at it the same way anymore. It's still creaky and unreliable, still sighs like it's exhausted by the weight of the world. But now, when I step inside and press the button for my floor, I can't help but whisper, "Thank you," just in case it's listening. So tell me, have you ever felt like a place, or even a thing, was trying to tell you something? Not in a spooky, supernatural way, but in a quiet, insistent way that you couldn't quite ignore? Or is it just me, getting overly sentimental about elevators and their secrets? Rain fell in sheets, the kind of relentless downpour that blurred the edges of the world. Zara pulled her hood tighter and hurried along the empty street, her boots splashing through puddles that had swallowed the cracked pavement. The city felt hollow tonight, its usual hum replaced by a strange, almost deliberate quiet. She glanced at her phone. No messages. No missed calls. The silence stretched, not just around her, but within her. Her building loomed ahead, a slab of concrete scarred by years of weather and neglect. She fumbled with her keys, her fingers numb from the cold, and pushed through the heavy door. The lobby was dim, lit only by the flicker of a dying fluorescent bulb. Mr. Howe, the elderly doorman, was absent. His usual station behind the desk was vacant, his mug of stale coffee untouched. Zara paused, her instinct whispering something she couldn't quite name, then shook it off and headed for the stairs. Her apartment was on the 6th floor, a small, cluttered space she had called home for 5 years. It wasn't much, but it was hers, a place to retreat when the weight of the world pressed too hard. Tonight, though, it felt different. She locked the door behind her, tossed her keys onto the counter, and froze. The room smelled faintly of damp earth, a scent that didn't belong. The windows were closed. She checked them twice. "Hello?" she called, her voice louder than she intended. The word echoed, the emptiness mocking her. She set her bag down and walked through the apartment, her movements careful and deliberate. The living room was untouched. The kitchen, the same. Even her bedroom looked ordinary, though the unease persisted, clinging to her like a second skin. On her desk, a sheet of paper fluttered, caught by the draft from somewhere unseen. Zara frowned. She hadn't left anything there. She picked it up, her pulse quickening. The words were scrawled in an uneven hand, the ink smudged as though written in haste. "I don't belong here." There was no signature, no context, just that one cryptic sentence. She flipped the page over, but it was blank. Zara stared at the note for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. A prank? Someone breaking in to mess with her? But why leave something so strange? She grabbed her phone, dialed Mr. Howe's number, and waited. The line rang and rang, then went to voicemail. The rain continued to drum against the windows, a steady rhythm that matched the pounding of her heart. She considered calling the police, but what would she say? That someone had left a note that made her feel uneasy? It wasn't enough. She dropped the paper on the table and paced the room, her thoughts racing. Hours passed, though they felt stretched and elastic, the minutes crawling in slow motion. At some point, exhaustion overtook her, and she fell asleep on the couch, the note still sitting where she had left it. She woke to darkness, the kind that made her question whether her eyes were even open. The power was out. The glow of the streetlights through the blinds was gone. Even the steady hum of the refrigerator had ceased. The silence was complete, thick and oppressive. She reached for her phone, its screen cutting through the dark. It was 3:12 a.m., and her battery was nearly dead. Zara stood, her limbs heavy, and moved toward the kitchen, guided by memory. The flashlight was in the top drawer, though she rarely used it. Her fingers closed around the handle, and she flicked it on, the beam piercing the void. The smell of damp earth was stronger now, almost suffocating. She swept the light across the room and froze. There, by the window, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, draped in something dark that rippled faintly, as if caught in an unseen breeze. Its head was tilted, the contours of its face obscured by shadow. "Who are you?" Zara demanded, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound strong. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It was as if it were carved from the air itself, a presence more than a person. Zara took a step back, her hand clutching the flashlight so tightly her knuckles ached. "I'm calling the police," she said, though her voice faltered. The figure tilted its head further, an almost curious gesture, and then it moved. Not toward her, but away, dissolving into the dark with a sound like dry leaves crumbling. The room was empty again, but the air felt heavier, as though the space it had occupied had been permanently altered. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn came, weak and pale, she grabbed her keys and left. The city seemed brighter in the daylight, its normalcy almost jarring after the events of the night. Zara went to a cafe, ordered coffee she didn't drink, and sat by the window, her thoughts a tangled knot she couldn't unravel. She returned home reluctantly, the daylight offering only a fragile sense of safety. The note was still on the table, mocking her. This time, she burned it, watching the paper curl and blacken in the kitchen sink. The smell of smoke mingled with the ever-present damp earth, a reminder she couldn't escape. The figure didn't return that night, nor the next, but the unease remained, growing with each passing day. The power outages became frequent, each plunge into darkness accompanied by the faintest whisper of movement, the suggestion of something watching. Zara avoided her apartment as much as possible, but there was nowhere else to go. Every time she stepped through her door, she felt the weight of the unseen pressing against her. It wasn't until the third week that she found another note, taped to her bathroom mirror. The handwriting was the same, uneven and hurried. This one read, "It's waking up." Zara didn't wait to understand what it meant. She packed a bag, left her apartment, and didn't look back. She moved in with a friend across town, paying half the rent for a couch and a sliver of peace. For a while, it worked. The nights grew quieter, her dreams less vivid. The smell of damp earth faded from her memory. But one evening, as she walked home from the corner store, she noticed something. A figure, standing beneath a street lamp at the end of her block. It was tall, draped in something dark that rippled faintly, as if caught in an unseen breeze. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its head tilted ever so slightly, and Zara's breath caught in her throat. She dropped her groceries and ran, the sound of her heartbeat drowning out everything else. When she reached her building, she fumbled with the lock, her fingers trembling. She slammed the door behind her, bolting it shut. But the quiet was different now, deeper and more final. She turned to find another note on the floor, resting where she hadn't noticed before. This time, it wasn't handwritten. It was printed in neat, even letters. "You belong to it now." When I was a kid, my father used to tell me that the world was much bigger than it looked. He wasn't talking about geography, though I didn't know that at the time. "There's more to see than what your eyes can find," he'd say, usually while fixing something in the garage. It always felt like a riddle, and I assumed it was just one of those mysterious grown-up phrases like "time flies" or "life isn't fair." But every now and then, he'd stop what he was doing, wipe the grease from his hands, and tell me a story about hidden rooms and buildings no one had ever drawn blueprints for, about staircases that went farther up or down than they should, about doors that opened onto places no one had walked in decades, if ever. At the time, I thought he was making it all up. Looking back, I think he might have been trying to warn me. It wasn't until years later, long after my father had passed and the stories had faded into the background of my mind, that I found the first one. I was living in a city by then, a couple of states away from the house I grew up in. I'd taken a job I didn't love, working hours that blurred into each other, living in a little apartment that I told myself was temporary, but was starting to feel permanent. One Sunday, I went for a walk, hoping to shake off the heaviness that had settled on me after another long week. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just picked a direction and started moving. The city was quieter than usual, as it often was on Sundays. Most of the stores were closed, the streets almost empty except for the occasional jogger or dog walker. I turned down a narrow alley I'd never noticed before, a shortcut between two old brick buildings, and stopped halfway through. There, embedded in the side of one of the buildings, was a door. It wasn't just any door. It was small, no taller than my waist, with a rounded top like the ones you'd see in old cottages and storybooks. The wood was dark and weathered, with cracks running through it like veins, and the handle was a simple brass knob. What made it strange wasn't just that it was there, though that alone was odd enough, but that it didn't seem to belong to anything. There was no visible frame, no stairs leading up or down, no signs that anyone had opened it in years. It was just there, halfway up the wall, defying logic. For a while, I just stood there, staring at it. The more I looked, the more I felt that strange pull in my chest, the same feeling I used to get when my dad told me his stories. A part of me wanted to walk away, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but another part, the part that remembered those stories, kept whispering, "What if?" I climbed up the side of the wall as best I could, using the uneven bricks as footholds, and reached for the door. My fingers hesitated on the knob, slick with sweat despite the cold. It felt warm, like it had been sitting in the sun. Even though the alley was in shadow, I turned it slowly, expecting it to be locked, but it wasn't. The door swung open without a sound. Behind it was a staircase, spiraling downward into the dark. I couldn't see where it led, just step after step, disappearing into the blackness. For a moment, I thought about climbing back down, about shutting the door and never thinking about it again. But then I remembered what my dad used to say, "There's more to see than what your eyes can find." So I stepped through. The first thing I noticed was the air. It wasn't stale like I expected it to be. It was cool and clean, with a faint scent of pine, like the woods behind my childhood home. The staircase was narrow, the walls made of the same worn brick as the building above, but the further I went, the smoother the walls became. The bricks gave way to stone, and the stone to something else entirely, something glossy and dark, like polished obsidian. My footsteps echoed faintly as I descended, the sound growing softer and softer until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the silence. I don't know how long I walked. Time felt strange there, stretched thin and elastic. It could have been 10 minutes, or an hour, or a whole day. The stairs ended abruptly, depositing me into a wide, open room with no ceiling. Above me was nothing but a vast, starless sky, black and endless. The walls of the room were made of the same glossy material as the staircase, and in the center stood a table. It was a simple wooden table, small and unremarkable, except for the object sitting on top of it. It was a clock, but not like any clock I'd ever seen. The face was round and silver, the numbers etched into it in a language I didn't recognize. The hands moved in opposite directions, one spinning clockwise, the other counterclockwise, but they never crossed. The pendulum beneath it swung slowly, each movement impossibly smooth, as if it were underwater. It didn't make a sound. I stepped closer, drawn to it in the same way I'd been drawn to the door. My reflection shimmered in the polished surface of the clock, distorted like I was looking into a funhouse mirror. As I leaned closer, I saw something in the reflection, something behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. Nothing but the table, the clock, and the walls stretching endlessly into the void. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a threatening feeling, exactly, but it wasn't comforting either. It was like being watched by someone who was waiting to see what you would do next. I turned back to the clock and noticed a small brass key sitting beside it. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. The key was delicate, almost fragile, but it felt heavier than it should when I picked it up. As soon as my fingers closed around it, the pendulum stopped swinging. I don't remember climbing back up the stairs. I don't remember leaving the alley. The next thing I knew, I was standing outside my apartment, the key still clutched in my hand. I don't know how I got there, but I felt different, like a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. That night, I dreamed of the clock. I saw its hands spinning in opposite directions, faster and faster until the numbers on its face blurred into nothingness. I heard my dad's voice, soft and distant, saying, "There's more to see than what your eyes can find." When I woke up, the key was still on my nightstand. I've thought about going back to the alley, but something tells me I won't find the door again. I'm not even sure it was ever really there. But the key is real. I keep it in my pocket now, turning it over in my hand whenever I feel that familiar pull in my chest, that strange sense of possibility. I don't know what it opens, or if it opens anything at all, but I can't bring myself to let it go. There are places in the world we aren't meant to understand, places that don't fit neatly into maps or logic, or the stories we tell ourselves about how the world works. My father knew that. He tried to tell me, in his own way, but I didn't listen until it was too late. I don't know if I'll ever find another door, or if I'd even have the courage to step through it again if I did. But I like to think there's a reason I was given the key, A reason the clock stopped for me. What about you? If you found a door that led to something you couldn't explain, would you open it? And if you did, what would you hope to find waiting for you on the other side? The day I found the letter, I was carrying a watermelon. It wasn't my watermelon. I'd been asked to bring it to the neighborhood block party by Mrs. Hargrave, who always smelled like rosewater and convinced everyone to do things by pretending it was a small favor. The watermelon was awkward to hold, heavy and slippery in its smooth green skin, and I kept having to stop to shift its weight. That's why I noticed the letter. It was wedged between the iron bars of a gate, just barely visible under a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. If I hadn't stopped to rest, I would have walked right past it. I didn't mean to grab it, but something about the way it was stuck there, forgotten and ignored, made me curious. The envelope was thick, almost like parchment, and sealed with wax. Actual wax, not one of those cheap sticker seals you buy at craft stores. The wax was deep red and embossed with a symbol I didn't recognize, a crescent moon crossed with what looked like a feather. There was no address, no stamp, just my first name written in a careful, looping script, Evelyn. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank. Maybe someone had been watching me walk by, knew my name, and thought it would be funny to mess with me. But there was no one around, and the dust on the envelope suggested it had been there for a long time. Months, maybe even years. My curiosity got the better of me, and I tucked the letter into my bag, balancing the watermelon on my hip as I hurried to the block party. The rest of the day passed in a haze of small talk, lemonade, and folding chairs that sank too far into the grass. I almost forgot about the letter until I got home and emptied my bag, the envelope falling onto my kitchen table. It felt heavier than it should have, like it was holding more than just paper. I hesitated for a moment before breaking the seal. Inside, there were 3 things: a folded sheet of paper, a small brass key, and a photograph. The photograph caught my attention first. It was black and white, slightly faded, showing a small group of people standing in front of a building I didn't recognize. At the center of the group was a woman who looked almost exactly like me. She had the same sharp cheekbones, the same wave in her hair, even the same faint dimple in her left cheek that only showed when she smiled. But it wasn't me. It couldn't have been me. The photo looked like it had been taken decades ago, maybe even in the 1940s. I unfolded the paper next, my hands shaking slightly. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope, looping and elegant. It read, "Evelyn, if you found this, it means you're ready. The key opens the door at 23 Holloway Street. What you'll find there belongs to you, but only if you're willing to look for it. Be careful, and don't trust what's easy." There was no signature, no explanation, just those cryptic words and the key, sitting heavy in my palm. For the rest of the night, I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. Who had written it? How long had it been sitting in that gate? And why did the woman in the photograph look so much like me? I even checked my family photo albums, flipping through old pictures to see if there was some distant relative I didn't know about who might explain the resemblance. But nothing matched. By the next morning, my curiosity had won. I looked up 23 Holloway Street. It wasn't far, just a 15-minute walk from my apartment, in a part of town I'd never had a reason to visit. The building turned out to be an old boarding house, 3 stories tall with faded brick and ivy climbing the walls. The windows were dark, and the paint on the front door was peeling, but the brass number above it gleamed like it had been polished recently. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, gripping the key in my pocket and wondering if I should just turn around. But something about the letter, the photograph, kept pulling me forward. The key fit perfectly. The lock clicked open with a smoothness that felt almost rehearsed, and I stepped inside. The air inside the boarding house was cool and smelled faintly of cedar. The entryway was narrow, with a staircase that curved upward and a long hallway leading to several closed doors. There was no one around. No receptionist, no guests, not even the creak of floorboards that would have suggested someone else was inside. I wandered down the hall, unsure of what I was looking for, until I came to a door at the very end. The number on the door was 7, painted in gold. Something told me this was the one. I slid the key into the lock, and the door swung open. The room was small, almost like a studio apartment, but it didn't feel abandoned. A faint layer of dust covered the furniture, but everything else was intact. A small bed with a quilt folded neatly at the foot, a writing desk with a typewriter sitting on it, shelves filled with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. On the desk was another letter, addressed to me in the same handwriting. I opened it, my breath catching in my throat. Evelyn, you found it. This room is yours now. It's always been yours, though you didn't know it yet. Everything inside belonged to her, the woman you saw in the photograph. She was like you. She left this behind for you, just as you'll leave something behind for the next one. There are answers here, but only if you're willing to stay long enough to find them. Look in the drawer. There was no name, no signature, just that same cryptic tone that offered more questions than answers. My hands trembling, I opened the drawer of the desk. Inside was a journal, its leather cover soft and worn. I flipped it open to the first page, and my heart nearly stopped. It was written in my handwriting, but it wasn't mine. The entries were dated from decades ago, starting in 1943. They told the story of a woman named Evelyn, my name, who had rented this room during the war. She wrote about her life, her fears, the people she'd met. She wrote about feeling like she didn't belong, like she was caught between two worlds, searching for something she couldn't name. And as I read, I felt like I was reading my own thoughts, my own doubts and hopes, echoed back to me across time. The last entry was the shortest. It simply said, "If you're reading this, it means you found me. Welcome home." I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the journal, trying to make sense of what I was reading. The room felt alive around me, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. I thought about leaving, about locking the door behind me and pretending I'd never come here. But I couldn't. Something about the room, the journal, the photograph. It felt like a piece of me I didn't know I'd lost. I stayed. Not forever, but long enough. Long enough to learn that the woman in the photograph wasn't just someone who looked like me. She was me. Or maybe I was her. Long enough to write my own entries in the journal, to leave something behind for whoever would come next. Because there would be a next. The room had a way of calling people, of finding them when they needed it most. Years later, when I finally locked the door behind me for the last time, I slid the key back into the gate where I'd found it. It wasn't mine anymore. It was waiting for someone else. Someone who would see their name on the envelope and wonder what lay beyond the door. Someone who would find their way home. Have you ever stumbled into something that felt like it was waiting just for you? Something that didn't make sense but felt right anyway? There's a coffee shop 3 blocks from my apartment, tucked at the corner of a narrow street that seems to twist in on itself. It's not the kind of place you'd notice unless you were specifically looking for it. No bright signs, no cheerful chalkboards with the day's specials. Just a faded green awning with the words "Couple Lost Time" painted in delicate, almost hesitant script. I'd walked past it dozens of times, always meaning to stop in but never quite finding the time. Until one morning, when I left my apartment to find my usual cafe closed for renovations, and the little green awning seemed to pull me toward it like a magnet. The moment I stepped inside, the air shifted. It was warm, not just in temperature but in feeling, like stepping into someone's memory. The smell of coffee was rich and earthy, tinged with something faintly sweet, like cinnamon or honey. The light was soft, filtering in through curtains that hung just slightly askew. There were only a handful of tables, each mismatched but somehow perfectly placed, and the counter was cluttered with an assortment of jars and mugs that looked like they'd been collected over decades. Behind the counter stood a man, tall and thin, with a face that seemed both young and ancient at the same time. His hair was a storm of gray and black curls, and his eyes were sharp, glinting with something that felt like knowing. "Morning," he said, his voice smooth and quiet, like the hum of a record player at the end of a song. "What can I get you?" I hesitated, glancing at the handwritten menu on the wall. It wasn't long, just a list of standard drinks, nothing fancy or complicated. "Just a black coffee," I said. "Good choice," he replied, though his tone made it sound like he already knew what I'd pick. As he moved to make my coffee, I noticed a strange object sitting on the counter. A bell, small and tarnished, its surface etched with intricate patterns. It looked out of place among the jars and mugs, as if it belonged to a different kind of space entirely. "Nice bell," I said, more to fill the silence than anything. The man glanced at it, his expression unreadable. "It's not just a bell," he said, setting my coffee on the counter. "It's how you order something special." "Special?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the counter. "Most people come here for coffee, for something familiar. But sometimes, people need something else. Something they don't even know they're looking for. That's what the bell is for." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but he didn't laugh. His face was calm, serious. "How does it work?" I asked, playing along. "You ring it," he said simply, "and I bring you what you need. Not what you want, mind you, what you need. There's a difference." I considered his words, unsure whether he was joking or just eccentric. The air around us seemed to hum faintly, as if the room itself were holding its breath. "And what if I don't like what I need?" I asked. "Then you leave it on the counter," he said. "No harm, no foul. But most people take it with them." I glanced at the bell again, my curiosity battling with my skepticism. Finally, I reached out and gave it a soft ring. The sound was higher than I expected, clear and sharp, cutting through the warm air like a shard of glass. The man's expression didn't change, but I thought I saw the faintest flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "Wait here," he said, disappearing through a door behind the counter. I sipped my coffee, glancing around the room. The other patrons didn't seem to notice me, or the bell, or the strange weight that had settled over the space. They sat in quiet pairs or alone, lost in books or conversations that seemed just slightly too quiet to hear. When the man returned, he was holding a small package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a thin piece of twine. He placed it on the counter in front of me, his hands lingering on it for just a moment. "This is yours," he said. "Take it home. Open it when you're alone." I frowned, suddenly unsure if I wanted whatever was inside. "What is it?" He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that answered nothing. "What you need," he said again. "Go on now." I paid for the coffee and the package, though he didn't name a price. When I tried to ask how much, he waved a hand dismissively, as if the transaction was already done. I left the shop feeling uneasy, the package tucked under my arm like a secret I hadn't meant to keep. At home, I set the package on the kitchen table and stared at it. It was small, barely the size of a paperback book, but it felt heavier than it should. I thought about leaving it unopened, about taking it back to the shop and pretending none of this had happened, but something about it wouldn't let me look away. Finally, I untied the twine and peeled back the paper. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, the edges worn and curling slightly. It showed a man and a woman standing on a bridge, their faces lit with laughter. The woman was holding a red umbrella, though the photo had no color, and the man had a hand raised as if he were explaining something to her. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The man in the photo was my father. Younger, thinner, but unmistakably him. And the woman was someone I'd never seen before. Not my mother, not any relative I knew. She was beautiful, her smile wide and unguarded, and the way they stood together felt intimate, like they belonged to each other in a way that was undeniable. My hands trembled as I turned the photo over. On the back, written in a neat, flowing script, was a single date, June 12, 1983. I did the math in my head, 2 years before I was born. I stared at the photo for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Who was she? What did she mean to him? Why had I never heard of her? The questions piled up, each one heavier than the last, until I felt like I couldn't breathe. I thought about calling my father, demanding an explanation, but the thought of his voice on the other end of the line made my stomach twist. Instead, I slipped the photo back into the paper and set it on the counter. I didn't know what to do with it, or what it meant, or why the man in the coffee shop thought I needed to see it. But as I stood there, staring at the little package, I realized something. I had needed it. Whatever the photo represented, whatever it would lead to, it was a piece of something I'd been missing without even knowing. The next morning, I went back to the coffee shop, but when I turned the corner, the little green awning was gone. The building was there, but the door was boarded up, the windows dark. A passing neighbor told me the shop had been closed for years, that no one had seen the owner in decades. I still have the photo. I haven't shown it to anyone, Not yet. Some days, I take it out and stare at it, searching for answers in the grainy lines of their faces. Other days, I leave it in its paper wrapping, pretending it doesn't exist. But I know it's there, waiting, and I know, eventually, I'll have to find out what it means. Have you ever been given something you didn't ask for, but couldn't let go of? Something that felt like a question only you could answer? There's a road near the outskirts of my town that doesn't appear on any map. It doesn't have a name or a sign, and if you didn't know to look for it, you'd probably miss it altogether. It's nothing more than a dirt path, barely wide enough for a car, framed by drooping trees that look like they've been there for centuries. Most people don't talk about it, and those who do usually describe it as a dead end, just a forgotten strip of land that leads nowhere. But that's not entirely true. It's not that the road doesn't lead anywhere. It's that no one's quite sure where it leads. The first time I heard about the road was at a party, one of those loud, chaotic gatherings where everyone's too drunk to care about who's listening. A guy I vaguely recognized from high school was telling a group of us about the time he and his friends had dared each other to drive down it at midnight. "We didn't get far," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The trees got too close, and the headlights didn't reach far enough. It was like the road swallowed the light. We turned around after 10 minutes, but I swear I saw something move in the woods." The others laughed it off, but his words stayed with me. I wasn't sure if it was the way he said it or the look in his eyes, but something about the story felt different from the usual small-town rumors. He wasn't exaggerating to make himself seem brave, and he wasn't playing it off as a joke. He was serious, in a quiet, unsettling way that made me want to ask more questions. I didn't, though. I let the conversation drift to other topics, and by the end of the night, I'd almost convinced myself it didn't matter. But it did. It stuck with me like a splinter in the back of my mind, until one night, weeks later, I decided to see the road for myself. It was late, close to midnight, and the town was quiet in that eerie, too still way that only happens after everyone's gone to bed. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. I just got in my car and drove, taking the winding back roads until the trees grew thicker and the houses disappeared. It didn't take long to find the road. Even though I'd never been there before, I recognized it immediately. The narrow dirt path, the way the trees arched overhead like a tunnel, their branches tangling together to block out the stars. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel, before turning onto the path. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. My car's tires crunched softly against the dirt, but beyond that, there was nothing. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of traffic. Just silence, thick and heavy, pressing against the windows like a blanket. My headlights cut through the darkness, but the light didn't seem to reach far. The trees on either side of the road stood like sentinels, their trunks pale and smooth, their branches unmoving. I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, the pit of my stomach twisting with a mix of curiosity and unease. The road was straight, unchanging, and I began to wonder if the guy from the party had been right. Maybe it really didn't go anywhere. Maybe this was just another dead-end path, a relic from when the town was younger, leading to an old farm or quarry that no longer existed. Then I saw the figure. It was standing in the middle of the road, just outside the reach of my headlights. At first, I thought it was a person. A man, maybe, tall and still, his outline faint against the dark trees. I slowed the car, squinting to see better, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a man at all. It was something else. Its body was too thin, its limbs too long, its posture unnatural, as though it had been caught mid-step and frozen in place. I stopped the car, my heart pounding in my chest, and stared. The figure didn't move. It didn't react to the headlights, didn't acknowledge me in any way. It just stood there, its head tilted slightly to one side, as though it were listening for something. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, unable to decide whether to reverse or keep going. The figure didn't come closer, but the air around it seemed wrong somehow, like the space it occupied didn't follow the same rules as everything else. Eventually, I put the car in reverse and backed away slowly, the figure growing smaller and smaller in my rearview mirror until it disappeared completely. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, the narrow path behind me fading into the shadows. My hands were shaking, my chest tight, but the moment I turned onto a familiar street, it was as though the tension broke. The air felt normal again, and the night was filled with the comforting sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. I told myself I'd imagined it, that the figure was just a trick of the light or a shadow cast by the trees. I didn't go back, but that wasn't the end of it. The next morning, I found a small, perfectly round hole in the driver's side window of my car. It wasn't a crack or a chip, but an actual hole, clean and precise, like someone had drilled straight through the glass. There was no debris, no sign of what had caused it, just an empty circle, barely the size of a pencil eraser. I touched it, half expecting the glass to crumble, but it held firm. The edges were smooth, cool to the touch. Over the next few days, the hole grew. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it was undeniable. By the end of the week, it was the size of a coin, then a baseball, then bigger. The edges remained smooth, the glass refusing to splinter or shatter, even as the hole expanded. I tried covering it with tape, but the tape slid off, as though the glass had become frictionless. I took it to a mechanic, but the man behind the counter just stared at the window, his expression unreadable, and said, "We don't fix things like that." By the time the hole was large enough to fit my hand through, I stopped driving the car altogether. I left it in the garage, closing the door and locking it tight, but the damage had already been done. The hole wasn't confined to the car anymore. It had started to spread. It appeared on my bedroom window next, a small, perfect circle that seemed to form overnight. Then the bathroom mirror, the window above the kitchen sink. Each one grew at the same slow, steady pace, the edges smooth and flawless, the surfaces around them untouched. I started to feel it, too, the wrongness, the same sense of displacement I'd felt on the road. It followed me, lingering at the edges of my vision, whispering just out of earshot. I haven't slept in days. The holes are everywhere now, in every reflective surface, growing larger and larger, swallowing the glass and leaving behind nothing but emptiness. I don't know what's on the other side, but I can feel it watching me, waiting. I think about the road sometimes, about the figure standing so still in the headlights. I wonder if I was supposed to keep going, if the road would have ended somewhere, or if it would have gone on forever, dragging me deeper into whatever place it came from. I don't think I'll ever find out. The holes are too big now, and I can feel the pull of them growing stronger, tugging at the edges of my thoughts, my memories, my reality. I don't know what happens when they reach me, but I think I'm about to find out. The first time I saw the piano, it was sitting in a field, not in a house, not in a barn or under some half-collapsed gazebo. A field, an ordinary stretch of grass and wildflowers that shouldn't have had anything but cows, or maybe an abandoned tractor rusting into the dirt. I had been driving back from my cousin's wedding, taking the scenic route because I wasn't in the mood to merge onto a highway filled with impatient tailgaters, when I caught it out of the corner of my eye. A grand piano, black as oil and gleaming like someone had polished it just that morning. Its lid was propped open, and the bench was angled perfectly in front of it. The strangest thing was how pristine it looked. The legs didn't seem to sink into the ground, and the wood wasn't warped by rain or sun. It was perfect, untouched, sitting alone in the middle of nowhere. I would have kept driving, probably should have kept driving, but something about it made me slow down, then stop entirely. I pulled over to the side of the road, gravel crunching beneath my tires, and got out of the car. The wind was soft, brushing through the tall grass in waves, and there was no one around, no sign of another vehicle or a house nearby. Just the piano, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there before I decided to walk over to it. My boots sank into the earth as I crossed the field, the smell of damp soil rising around me. As I got closer, I noticed details I couldn't see from the road. The piano wasn't just perfect, it was beautiful. The wood was polished to a mirror-like shine, and the edges were lined with delicate carvings of vines and flowers that seemed to shift slightly when I looked at them too long. When I reached out and touched the lid, it was cool and smooth, like it had been pulled from a concert hall just moments ago. I should have left it alone. That much was obvious. But there was something in me, some pull, some need. that made me sit down on the bench. The keys gleamed under the sunlight, untouched and flawless, and when I pressed one, the note rang out clear and true. The sound was richer than any piano I'd ever heard, a depth that seemed to vibrate in my chest and settle somewhere behind my ribs. I pressed another key, then another, and soon I was playing a song I hadn't thought about in years, something I'd learned as a kid and had forgotten almost entirely. My fingers moved with a certainty that surprised me, like they had a memory all their own, and the music filled the air around me, sharp and alive, as though the piano wasn't just echoing the notes but breathing them into the world. I don't know how long I played, but when I finally stopped, my hands trembling slightly from the effort, the field around me had changed. The sun was lower now, brushing the tops of the grass with streaks of gold, and the wind had stilled entirely. There was no sound, no birds, no insects, not even the faint rush of distant cars on the road. Just silence, heavy and thick, pressing against my ears. I stood up, suddenly uneasy, and as I did, I noticed something carved into the edge of the bench where I'd been sitting. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. The carving was shallow but precise, letters etched with the kind of care that didn't come from someone scratching idly with a knife. 3 words, "Play it again." I backed away, my pulse hammering, and stumbled over the uneven ground as I made my way back to the car. When I turned to look over my shoulder, the piano was still there, as perfect and out of place as ever, but now it felt like it was watching me. The thought was absurd, I knew that, but it didn't stop me from getting into my car and driving away as fast as I could. I told myself I wouldn't think about it again, that it was probably some weird art installation or a prank meant to confuse passers-by. But that night, I dreamed of the piano. I dreamed of the sound of the keys, ringing out in a melody I didn't recognize but couldn't forget. I dreamed of the carvings along its edges, the vines twisting and growing until they wrapped around my wrists, pulling me closer. I dreamed of the field, the grass swaying in a wind I couldn't feel, and the faint whisper of those words, "Play it again." When I woke up, the memory of the dream clung to me like damp clothes. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home, something quiet and patient, waiting just out of sight. I tried to distract myself, throwing myself into work and errands, but nothing worked. The image of the piano stayed lodged in my mind, its black surface gleaming like a pool of ink, its keys promising something I couldn't name but desperately wanted to touch again. By the 3rd day, I couldn't resist anymore. I told myself I just needed to know if it was still there, if I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The drive back to the field felt longer this time, the road stretching endlessly in front of me, but when I rounded the last bend, my breath caught in my throat. The piano was gone. The field was empty now, just grass and wildflowers swaying gently in the wind. I parked the car and got out, half expecting it to reappear as soon as I stepped into the field, but it didn't. I walked to the spot where it had been, the ground still damp and soft beneath my boots, and found nothing. No marks, no indentations, no sign that anything had ever been there. It should have been a relief, but instead, I felt hollow, like something important had slipped through my fingers. That night, the dreams came back. This time, they weren't just of the piano but of people, shadowy figures standing in the field, their faces blurred and indistinct, their heads tilted as though they were listening. I couldn't see what they were looking at, but I could hear it. The music, sharp and clear. The same melody I had played that day, but faster now, more frantic. And underneath it all, a voice, low and insistent, whispering the same 3 words, "Play it again." I woke up gasping, my heart racing, and when I sat up, I realized the music hadn't stopped. It was faint but unmistakable, drifting through my bedroom like smoke. I followed it, my legs unsteady, and found myself standing in my living room, staring at the empty corner where nothing should have been. But the music was louder now, and as I reached out, my fingers brushing against the empty air, I felt it, the cool, smooth surface of polished wood. I don't remember sitting down. I don't remember touching the keys, but I remember the sound. It wasn't just music anymore. It was a voice, a presence, something alive and vast and hungry, pouring itself into the world through my hands. The room around me faded, and for a moment, I was back in the field, the grass brushing against my legs, the wind still and heavy. The figures were there too, closer now, their faces still hidden but their presence undeniable. They were waiting, listening, and as the final note rang out, the voice spoke again, clearer this time, filling my mind with its impossible weight. Play it again. When I woke up, the piano was gone, but the music wasn't. It follows me now, everywhere I go, a constant melody at the edge of my hearing. And no matter how hard I try to ignore it, I know one thing for certain. It's waiting. For me. For the next song. For the moment when I can't resist anymore. The invitation came in the form of a card, tucked under my windshield wiper on a rainy Thursday afternoon. It wasn't there when I parked at the grocery store, but when I came out, arms full of bags and cursing the drizzle, it was waiting. At first, I thought it was another flyer for some obscure service, cleaning gutters, dog grooming, the usual. But as I peeled it off, I noticed the paper was thick, heavier than what you'd use for advertising. The ink was deep, almost glossy, like it had been pressed into the card rather than printed. There was no design, no logo, just a short message written in elegant script. We know you've been looking. Tonight at 10 p.m. Corner of Linden and Finch. Come alone. The message felt oddly personal, though I couldn't immediately place why. My first instinct was to toss it, to dismiss it as a prank or some kind of elaborate marketing gimmick, but as I stared at the words, something shifted in me. I hadn't told anyone I'd been looking. I hadn't even fully admitted it to myself. It wasn't something specific, not a job or a person or a tangible thing I could point to and say, that's it. But I'd been restless for months, waking up in the middle of the night with a strange ache in my chest, an unnamed longing that had started to bleed into my waking hours. I went through my days on autopilot, smiling when I needed to, answering questions, completing tasks, but always with the faint sense that I was meant to be somewhere else, doing something else. And now this card, with its impossible promise, was daring me to act on it. By the time 9:30 rolled around, I talked myself into going. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still slick, the streetlights reflecting in long, uneven streaks against the pavement. I left my phone at home, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe it was the word alone on the card, or maybe it was the creeping suspicion that whatever this was, it wasn't something I could explain later in a text message. Linden and Finch was only a 10-minute walk from my apartment, a quiet intersection where the city seemed to pause. The streets there were lined with aging brick buildings, their windows dark except for the occasional flicker of a television or the soft glow of a reading lamp. When I arrived, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to be looking for. The card hadn't mentioned a door or a building, just the corner itself. At first, I thought I was alone, but as I stepped closer to the curb, I noticed a figure standing under the street lamp across the street, half hidden in the shadows. They were tall, wrapped in a long coat that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. I hesitated, suddenly aware of how exposed I was, but then they stepped forward, raising a hand in a gesture that felt less like a greeting and more like an invitation. "Are you ready?" the figure asked, their voice low and unhurried. "For what?" I replied, the words coming out sharper than I intended. They tilted their heads slightly, as if considering my question. "For what you've been looking for." I should have laughed, should have walked away, but something about the way they said it, calm, certain, like they knew me better than I knew myself, made me stay. "Follow me," they said, turning before I could respond. They led me down a narrow alley I'd never noticed before, the walls on either side so close they almost touched. The air grew colder as we walked, the faint hum of the city fading into silence. I thought about turning back, but the figure moved with such purpose that I found myself following without question. At the end of the alley was a door. It was unmarked, made of dark, weathered wood that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. The figure stopped and pressed their hand against the surface, and the door swung open silently, revealing a staircase that spiraled downward. "Do I get to know where this leads?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended in the stillness. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they gestured toward the stairs, their expression unreadable. I hesitated, my mind racing through all the ways this could go wrong. But beneath the fear, there was something else. An ache, a pull, like the air itself was urging me forward. I stepped through the doorway and began to descend. The staircase seemed to go on forever, the walls around me shifting from brick to stone to something smooth and black, like polished obsidian. The air grew warmer the deeper I went, carrying a faint scent I couldn't place. Something metallic, almost coppery, but not unpleasant. When I finally reached the bottom, I found myself in a cavernous space lit by a soft, golden light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The room was circular, the ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. In the center was a table, and on the table was a single object, a book. It was large and bound in deep red leather, its cover embossed with the same spiral symbol from the card. The figure who had led me there stood beside it, their hands clasped in front of them. "This is it?" I asked, my voice echoing faintly. "This is where it begins," they replied. I approached the table, my footsteps unnaturally loud against the smooth floor. The book seemed to hum faintly as I drew closer, a vibration I could feel in my chest more than hear. When I placed my hands on the cover, the hum grew stronger, the air around me thickening. "Open it," the figure said. The moment I lifted the cover, the light in the room dimmed, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The pages were blank, but as I stared at them, words began to form, scrawling themselves across the surface in ink that shimmered like liquid gold. The words weren't in any language I recognized, but I understood them all the same. They weren't just words, they were memories. My memories. Moments I hadn't thought about in years, things I hadn't realized I'd forgotten. My first time riding a bike. The way my grandmother's hands felt when she held mine. The sound of my father's laugh before he got sick. I turned the pages, each one filled with fragments of my life, until I reached one that was blank. As I stared at it, the golden ink began to flow again. But this time, the words weren't memories, they were instructions. They told me to place my hand on the page. I looked up at the figure, who nodded once, their expression calm but expectant. My pulse raced, my mind screaming at me to stop, but my hand moved on its own, pressing against the blank page. The moment my skin touched the paper, the room dissolved. I was no longer in the cavern, no longer in the city. I was standing in the middle of a vast, open field, the sky above me swirling with colors I'd never seen before. The air was alive, humming with energy, and in the distance, I saw a figure walking toward me, their form indistinct but familiar in a way that made my chest ache. "Do you see now?" the voice from the cavern said, though the figure was nowhere to be seen. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because somehow, I knew this was the place I'd been looking for all along. When I was 30, I took a sublet for a studio apartment in the city. It was one of those too-good-to-be-true deals, a month-to-month lease, dirt cheap rent, utilities included, and fully furnished. The Craigslist ad didn't even have pictures, just a description that made it sound like a steal. I was suspicious, sure, but when I showed up to see the place, the landlord didn't seem like a serial killer and the apartment itself wasn't falling apart. So I signed the lease on the spot. At the time, it felt like a win. I'd been couch surfing for months after my breakup, carrying my life around in trash bags and suitcases, so I wasn't exactly in a position to be picky. The studio was small but clean, with a big window that looked out over an alleyway. The walls were painted a soft, pale green, and the furniture, while old, was sturdy. There was a battered love seat, a tiny round table with mismatched chairs, and a bed shoved into the far corner beneath a framed print of a forest scene. The only strange thing about the place was the closet. It was huge for a studio, almost like it didn't belong. The door was one of those old, heavy types with a brass knob that didn't quite fit the frame, and the inside smelled faintly of cedar and something else I couldn't place. It wasn't a bad smell, just unusual. I moved in that same day and spent the next few weeks settling into my new routine. For the first time in a long time, things felt stable. I found a job at a coffee shop down the street, started making tentative plans to go back to school, and even managed to find a thrift store bookcase for the absurdly small price of $10. Life wasn't perfect, but it felt manageable, normal, even. And then, one night, I opened the closet. I hadn't needed to use it much up until that point. Most of my clothes stayed in suitcases, and I wasn't exactly swimming in belongings, so the closet mostly functioned as dead space. A place where I shoved things I didn't want to deal with. An old vacuum cleaner, a broken lamp, some cardboard boxes I didn't feel like unpacking. But on this particular night, I was looking for my winter coat. The temperature had dropped suddenly, and the only place I hadn't checked was the closet. I turned on the light, stepped inside, and froze. The first thing I noticed was that it felt colder than the rest of the apartment. Not just a little colder, much colder. Like I just stepped outside on a January morning without a jacket. The air had that same sharp bite, the kind that makes your skin tighten and your breath fog up. The second thing I noticed was the wall in the back. Or, more accurately, the lack of one. The closet didn't end where it was supposed to. Instead, it stretched back farther than it should have been able to. The narrow space extending into darkness that the overhead light couldn't reach. I don't mean it was a little bigger than expected. I mean it was impossible. I stepped out into the apartment, measured the length of the wall, and then stepped back inside. No matter how many times I checked, it didn't add up. The closet was longer than the apartment itself. I told myself it was an optical illusion, some weird quirk of old architecture. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. I could feel something about the space, something wrong, and the wrongness sat heavy in my chest like an ache. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, braced myself, and stepped back in. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing more cedar-lined walls and an unmarked cardboard box shoved into the corner. But beyond that, the space just kept going. My footsteps sounded off, echoing faintly, like I was walking through a tunnel instead of a closet. I didn't want to keep moving forward, but I didn't want to turn my back on it either. There was a pressure in the air, a faint, low hum that vibrated against my ribs, like standing too close to a speaker. I reached the box, crouched down, and pulled back the flaps. Inside was an assortment of random junk. Old Polaroid photos, a chipped mug, a book with the spine cracked in half. It was the kind of stuff you'd find at a yard sale, and none of it looked particularly interesting. But then I picked up one of the Polaroids and felt my stomach twist. It was a picture of my old apartment. Not the studio I was standing in, the one I'd lived in 3 years earlier with my ex. I recognized the ugly brown carpet and the sagging couch that we'd bought from a neighbor for $50. The photo was taken from the kitchen, looking into the living room, but the angle was all wrong, like it had been taken from a spot too high to be human. There was no date on the picture, no markings to indicate where it had come from, but it was unmistakable. It was mine. I set the photo back in the box, my hands shaking. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe the landlord had found it during renovations? Maybe I'd left it behind without realizing? But deep down, I knew it didn't make sense. I knew the box didn't belong there. I stood up, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached, and looked back toward the entrance of the closet. The light from the apartment was faint now, barely visible, as if I'd walked much farther than I thought. I took a step back, then another, keeping my flashlight trained on the walls. The cedar smell was stronger now, almost overpowering, and the hum in the air had grown louder, more insistent. I turned toward the light and started walking faster, my breath catching in my throat. But no matter how far I walked, the door didn't seem to get any closer. The walls around me seemed to stretch, the lines of the wood grain twisting and shifting in a way that made my stomach churn. And then, I heard it, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. It came from behind me, soft at first, then louder, closer. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to know what was there. I broke into a run, the flashlight bouncing in my hand, and finally, the doorway came into view. I stumbled out into the apartment, slamming the closet door shut behind me and shoving the love seat in front of it. My chest heaved, my pulse thundering in my ears, and for a long time, I just stood there, staring at the door like it might open on its own. The next morning, I called the landlord and told him I was leaving. I didn't care about the lease, didn't care about losing my deposit. I just wanted out. He didn't ask questions, didn't even seem surprised. I packed my things in less than an hour, shoving clothes and books into garbage bags and dragging them to my car. I left the love seat in front of the closet door and didn't look back. I still don't know what I walked into that night. I've tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the mind, that I was overtired or imagining things. But I can't shake the feeling that the closet was watching me, waiting for me to step just a little farther inside. Sometimes I dream about it, about the cedar smell, the stretching walls, the faint rustling that followed me in the dark. And sometimes, when I wake up, I could swear I still hear the hum, faint and low, vibrating in my chest. So, now I have to ask, have you ever come across something in your life, a place, a moment, a feeling that didn't make sense? Something you can't explain, no matter how hard you try? If you have, I'd love to hear about it. Maybe it'll make me feel a little less like the closet is still there, waiting for me to come back. There's a house on the edge of town that people never talk about. Not because it's haunted or abandoned or shrouded in tragedy. Nothing as theatrical as that. It's just there. A house like a forgotten book on a shelf. Its spine faded and unreadable. It doesn't loom or threaten. It doesn't decay or crumble. It simply exists, unremarkable and unchanging. On the corner of a cul-de-sac no one seems to visit. I'd walked by it hundreds of times growing up, always on my way to somewhere else, school, the grocery store, my best friend's house. It was one of those places you don't register even as your eyes pass over it. A pale green house with shutters that were once white and a front lawn that seemed perpetually overgrown but never wild. It had a single large oak tree in the yard, its roots pushing up against the sidewalk like it was trying to escape, and a mail slot on the front door that no one ever seemed to use. The house was always quiet, always still, always watching. It wasn't until the summer after my 30th birthday, when I'd moved back to town for what I told myself would only be a few months, that I noticed it again. I was walking the same route I'd walked as a kid, the air heavy with humidity and the sound of cicadas buzzing like static in the background, when the house caught my attention. Something was different, though I couldn't have said what. The shutters were the same off-white, the grass was the same uneven green, and yet it felt like the house had shifted somehow, like it had been nudged an inch closer to the sidewalk while I wasn't looking. I slowed down, my steps crunching against the broken pavement, and stopped in front of the oak tree. The house wasn't threatening, but it wasn't inviting either. It was the kind of place that made you feel like you were trespassing just by standing too close. And then I noticed something new. The mail slot on the door wasn't empty. A small, cream-colored envelope peeked out, its edges worn and curling like it had been there for weeks. Before I could talk myself out of it, I walked up the cracked path to the front door. My shoes scuffed against the concrete, and with each step, the world seemed to grow quieter. The cicadas faded, the distant hum of a lawnmower disappeared, even the sound of my own breathing softened. By the time I reached the door, it felt like I'd stepped into a vacuum where time itself had been paused. The envelope was unmarked, no name, no address, no stamp, just a plain cream rectangle, its edges stained faintly with dust. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder to see if anyone was watching, but the street was empty. It felt wrong to leave it there, sitting half-forgotten in the mail slot, so I reached out and pulled it free. The door opened, not all the way, just an inch or two, enough for me to catch a glimpse of the dim interior. I hadn't knocked, hadn't touched the handle, and yet there it was, a sliver of shadowy space waiting for me to decide what to do next. I held my breath, clutching the envelope, and gently pushed the door open with the tips of my fingers. The air inside was cool and still, carrying a faint smell of cedar and something sweeter, like vanilla or old flowers. The hallway stretched ahead of me, narrow and dim, lined with wallpaper that was once floral but had faded into a vague swirl of beige and green. At the far end was a doorway leading into another room, the light beyond it soft and golden, like late afternoon sunlight. "Hello?" My voice sounded strange in the stillness, too loud and too small at the same time. There was no answer. I don't know why I stepped inside. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the envelope in my hand, the way it seemed to hum faintly against my palm. Or maybe it was the house itself, pulling me forward with a gravity I didn't understand. Whatever the reason, I walked down the hallway, my footsteps muffled against the worn carpet. The room at the end of the hall was a living room, though it didn't look like anyone had lived there in years. The furniture was old but well kept, the kind of pieces you'd find in an estate sale. A high-backed armchair with wooden legs, a a coffee table with intricate carvings along the edges, a sofa covered in a pattern of faded roses. The walls were lined with bookshelves, each one crammed with volumes of varying sizes, their spines a mix of rich leather and worn paper. On the coffee table sat a single glass bell jar. Inside it was a key. The key was simple, silver and unadorned, resting on a small velvet cushion beneath the dome of glass. There was no plaque, no explanation, no indication of what the key might unlock. And yet, as I stepped closer, I felt the same pull I'd felt when I'd first noticed the house, the same strange gravity drawing me toward it. I reached out and lifted the bell jar. The air seemed to shift as I did, the light in the room dimming slightly, as if the house itself were holding its breath. I picked up the key. It was heavier than I expected, and turned it over in my fingers. There were no markings, no engravings, nothing to set it apart from any other key. And yet it felt important in a way I couldn't explain, like it had been waiting for me. That's when I noticed the door. It wasn't the front door, or the hallway door, or any of the doors I'd seen on my way in. This one was small, almost hidden, tucked into the far corner of the room behind a tall bookshelf. The frame was narrow, the wood painted the same pale green as the house's exterior, and the handle was a simple brass knob. It hadn't been there before, I was sure of it, but now it was, waiting. The key fit perfectly. The door swung open to reveal a staircase spiraling downward into the dark. The smell of cedar was stronger now, mingling with the faint metallic tang of old air. I hesitated on the threshold, the key still in my hand, and then, with a deep breath, stepped through. The stairs seemed to go on forever, each step creaking faintly under my weight. The further I descended, the more the air around me changed. It wasn't just cooler, it was thicker, like walking through water. And then, finally, the stairs ended, depositing me into a room that felt impossibly large. The walls were lined with mirrors, dozens of them, each one framed in a different style. Ornate gold, simple wood, cracked plaster. They weren't normal mirrors, though. They didn't reflect the room or me or anything else. Instead, each one showed a different scene. A forest at dusk, a city street glowing with neon signs, a snowy mountaintop bathed in moonlight. The scenes moved, alive and shifting, as though the mirrors were windows into other places. Other times, in the center of the room was a table, and on the table was another envelope. This one was addressed to me, my full name, written in elegant, looping handwriting I didn't recognize. I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I stood there, staring at the mirrors, at the scenes playing out in their depths, at the infinite possibilities stretching out before me. And for the first time in what felt like years, I wasn't afraid. What would you do if you found a house like that? If you found a door that led to something you couldn't explain, would you walk away? Or would you take the key and see how far it could lead you? On the corner of my street, there's a tiny convenience store with a crooked neon sign that reads, "Open," even when it's clearly closed. I pass it every day on my way to work, usually without thinking about it. But last Friday, something about it caught my eye. Maybe it was the flicker of the sign, or the way the morning light hit the window, but for the first time, I noticed the doorbell. It was an old, tarnished thing, the kind of button you'd expect to see on the front door of a house from the 1950s, not on a store. It sat just to the right of the doorframe, half hidden behind a peeling sticker advertising 2-for-1 energy drinks. The button looked worn, as though countless fingers had pressed it over the years, though I'd never once heard it ring. It wasn't until I was walking home later that evening that I felt the urge to stop. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement, and the store's windows were dark. The neon sign still flickered weakly, its light catching the edges of dusty cans and faded candy bars inside. I couldn't explain why, but the doorbell felt like it was waiting for me. It was such a small thing, almost insignificant, and yet it felt out of place, like it didn't belong to the store but had been borrowed from somewhere else and forgotten. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. No one else was around. The street was quiet, just the hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Before I could talk myself out of it, I pressed the button. The sound that followed wasn't what I expected. It wasn't the tinny chime of an ordinary doorbell, but something deeper, richer, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It vibrated through the soles of my shoes and echoed down the empty street, lingering long after it should have faded. For a moment, I thought nothing had happened. The door didn't open, and the store remained dark. But then, just as I was about to step back, I heard it, a faint click, like the sound of a lock turning. The door creaked open an inch, just enough to let out a sliver of warm, golden light. I hesitated, heart pounding, every instinct telling me to turn around and walk away. But curiosity is a stubborn thing. It pulls at you, whispering questions you don't really want answered but can't help asking anyway. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was warm and still, carrying the faint scent of something sweet and metallic, like old pennies dipped in honey. The interior of the store looked nothing like it had from the outside. The dusty shelves and faded candy bars were gone, replaced by rows of polished wooden cabinets, each lined with neatly arranged objects that gleamed under soft, amber lighting. There were no price tags, no advertisements, no signs to suggest this was a place where transactions took place. It felt more like a library or a museum, though the objects on display weren't books or artifacts. They were, I don't know, pieces of something, fragments. On one shelf, there was a jar filled with what looked like tiny, glowing beads of light, each one pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. On another, a small, intricately carved box sat half open, revealing a tangle of delicate wires that seemed to move on their own, like they were breathing. There were clocks with no hands, mirrors that reflected things that weren't in the room, and bottles of thick, black liquid that shimmered with flecks of gold when the light hit them. It was beautiful and strange, and it made my chest ache in a way I couldn't explain, like I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. At the far end of the store was a counter, and behind it stood a man. He was older, with a face like weathered stone and eyes that seemed to take in everything all at once. He didn't say anything as I approached, just tilted his head slightly, as if waiting for me to speak. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice sounding small in the heavy silence. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't offer answers but suggests you already know them if you think hard enough. "That depends," he said. His voice was low and steady, with the kind of calm authority that makes you want to listen, even if you don't understand. "What are you looking for?" "I'm not sure," I admitted, and it was true. I hadn't come in with a purpose, hadn't even planned to stop. But now that I was here, surrounded by these impossible things, I felt like I was searching for something without knowing what it was. The man nodded, as if my answer made perfect sense. "Take your time," he said, gesturing to the shelves. "Sometimes the thing you're looking for is the thing that finds you." I wandered through the store, running my fingers along the edges of the cabinets, marveling at the strange and beautiful things inside. There was a small glass orb filled with swirling mist that seemed to whisper faintly when I held it close. A pair of spectacles that, when I put them on, made the room shift and blur, as though I was seeing it from a different time. A single glove made of something that wasn't quite fabric, its surface rippling like water when I touched it. And then, on a shelf near the back, I saw it. A tiny music box, no bigger than the palm of my hand. It was made of dark wood, polished to a mirror-like shine, and when I lifted it, it felt heavier than it should have, as though it was carrying more than its size suggested. There was no crank, no obvious way to wind it, but as I turned it over in my hands, it began to play. The melody was soft and haunting, a series of notes that felt both unfamiliar and deeply, achingly familiar. It made my throat tighten, though I couldn't have said why. I didn't recognize the song, but it felt like it recognized me. When I brought it to the counter, the man looked at it for a long moment before meeting my eyes. "You're sure?" he asked. I nodded, though I wasn't. Not really. But the thought of leaving without it felt unbearable, like walking away from a door I was meant to open. He didn't name a price. He didn't even ask me for money. He just wrapped the music box in soft, dark paper and handed it to me with a nod. "Take care," he said, and there was something in his tone that made me think he wasn't just talking about the box. When I stepped back outside, the street was quiet and unchanged, the crooked neon sign still flickering weakly in the window. The music box felt heavy in my hands, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. But when I unwrapped it later that night, sitting at my kitchen table, the melody began to play again, soft and haunting, filling the room with something I couldn't quite name. I don't know what the music box is, or why it feels like it knows something about me that I don't. I've tried looking up the melody, but I can't find any trace of it. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear it playing faintly from the corner of the room, even when I'm sure I've left it closed. It doesn't scare me, not exactly, but it lingers in the back of my mind. A quiet question I don't know how to answer. I haven't been back to the store. Every time I pass it, the door is shut, the windows dark, the sign flickering in the same tired rhythm. I don't know if it's still there, or if it ever really was. But the music box is real, and sometimes, when I can't sleep, I let it play, hoping it might tell me something I haven't yet learned how to hear. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, one of those unspectacular hours when the world feels muted, as though it's forgotten to do anything interesting. I was at the laundromat, sitting in a plastic chair that wobbled slightly whenever I shifted my weight. My clothes were tumbling around in one of the machines, hypnotic in their motion, but I wasn't watching them. My attention was on the vending machine in the corner. It was ancient, covered in faded stickers advertising snacks that hadn't been stocked since the early 2000s. The buttons were worn smooth, their labels barely legible, but the glass front was clean enough to see my reflection if I leaned the right way. The thing is, I wasn't staring at my reflection. I was staring at the packet of pretzels stuck between two shelves inside. I hadn't even wanted pretzels when I came in, but now, watching them dangle there, just slightly out of reach, I couldn't think about anything else. The vending machine had swallowed my dollar with an air of indifference, the way it probably had for years, and now it was holding the pretzels hostage. I could still see the edge of the bag, tilted at an angle that promised nothing short of catastrophe if I dared to try shaking the machine. There's a special kind of rage that comes with vending machine betrayal, and I was teetering on the edge of it. I glanced around the laundromat. No one else seemed to care. A woman folding socks. A man reading a dog-eared paperback. Two kids chasing each other in circles around the folding tables. None of them noticed my existential crisis over a packet of sodium-laden snacks. I stood up and approached the machine, as if proximity might intimidate it into compliance. "Come on," I muttered, pressing my hands against the glass. The pretzels didn't budge. I tried rocking the machine, gently at first and then with increasing desperation. It groaned in protest, a deep metallic sound that seemed almost offended, but the pretzels stayed stubbornly in place. I banged on the glass, half hoping the noise would jar them loose, but all I managed to do was make the kids stop running long enough to watch me with wide, suspicious eyes. I sighed and stepped back, defeated. The machine had won. For now. When I sat down again, I noticed something. On the other side of the vending machine, wedged between it and the wall, was a small yellow envelope. I wouldn't have seen it if the light from the window hadn't caught its edge just right. It looked like it had been there for a while, dusty and bent at the corners, but still intact. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look, but it was too far away. I hesitated for a moment, then stood up and walked over, crouching down to retrieve it. The envelope was unmarked, no name or address or anything to suggest who it belonged to. I turned it over in my hands, half expecting it to be empty, but there was something inside. Something small and solid that shifted slightly when I moved it. I glanced around again, but no one seemed to notice me standing there, holding a mystery. For a moment, I considered leaving it where I'd found it. Whatever it wasn't mine, and I wasn't sure I wanted to invite any more weirdness into my already frustrating day. But curiosity has always been my Achilles heel, so I opened it. Inside was a single key. It was old, heavier than it looked, with a tarnished brass finish and a loop at the top that had been worn smooth over time. No markings, no label, just a key. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the weight of it, trying to imagine what it might open. A door? A lockbox? A safe? There was no way to know. All I had was this key, this strange, inexplicable thing that someone had left behind in the most ordinary place imaginable. I sat back down, the envelope in one hand and the key in the other, and stared at it like it might offer up answers if I looked long enough. It didn't, of course. It just sat there, mute and inscrutable. I thought about throwing it away. That would have been the sensible thing to do. Toss it in the trash and move on with my life. But I couldn't. Something about it wouldn't let me let it go. By the time my clothes were done, I decided to keep it. Not for any logical reason, but because it felt like the kind of thing you don't just discard. I slid it back into the envelope and tucked it into my pocket, and then I loaded my laundry into the basket and left the laundromat. The pretzels were still stuck in the vending machine, but I didn't care anymore. I had something else to think about. The key stayed in my pocket for the rest of the day, a quiet, heavy reminder of its presence. I kept reaching for it, running my fingers over the edge of the envelope, as if the texture might tell me something I hadn't noticed before. It didn't, but the act of holding it felt strangely comforting, like I'd been given a small, secret responsibility that no one else knew about. That night, I dreamed about locks. I was in a long hallway lined with doors, each one painted a different color. Some of them had brass handles, others iron knobs, and a few didn't have handles at all. I was holding the key, but every time I tried to use it, the lock would disappear, leaving me standing in front of a blank door. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, and no matter how far I walked, I couldn't find a single door that would let me in. When I woke up, I still had the key in my mind. It felt less like a dream and more like a message, though I couldn't say what it was trying to tell me. I got out of bed, grabbed the envelope from my jacket, and sat down at the kitchen table. I tipped the key out onto the surface and stared at it for a long time. It looked so ordinary, so unremarkable, and yet it carried this strange, magnetic weight that I couldn't ignore. I spent the next week trying to figure it out. I took the key with me everywhere, testing it on locks as though I might stumble across the one it belonged to by sheer coincidence. Apartment doors, bike locks, padlocks on fences. I tried them all. Nothing worked. People started giving me strange looks, but I didn't care. The key felt important in a way I couldn't explain, and I wasn't ready to give up on it yet. By the end of the week, though, I was no closer to an answer. The key had become a constant, quiet obsession, a puzzle with no edges or corners to build from. I thought about going back to the laundromat, asking the owner if they knew anything about it, but I doubted it would lead anywhere. Whoever had left the key behind, they were long gone. All that was left was me and the question they'd accidentally handed me. Eventually, I stopped trying to solve it. The key stayed in my pocket, a quiet companion to my everyday life, but I stopped testing it on locks. I stopped dreaming about doors. It became less of a mystery and more of a reminder of what I wasn't entirely sure. Maybe that some questions don't have answers, or maybe that the act of searching is its own kind of reward. I still have it. The key. It's sitting on my dresser now, catching the morning light in a way that makes it look newer than it is. I don't know what it opens, and I probably never will. But every time I see it, I can't help but wonder, what's waiting behind the lock it was meant for? And would I even recognize it if I found it? I was on the subway when the woman stepped on with her suitcase, and everything shifted. Not in the way things shift when the train jolts to life or lurches around a corner, but deeper. Like the air itself exhaled, as if reality took a single step back and tilted just slightly out of alignment. She wasn't remarkable at first glance. Mid-30s, maybe early 40s. Brown coat, dark hair pinned back, pale scarf looped around her neck. Her suitcase, though, was odd. An antique thing with brass corners and deep scratches running across its faded leather surface, as though it had been dragged through a dozen lifetimes. She didn't look like someone who owned an antique suitcase. She looked like someone who lived on takeout and worked in a gray cubicle under fluorescent lights. The train was half empty. She chose a seat directly across from me. I pretended not to notice her staring, but it was hard to ignore. Not overtly hostile or even curious, just a steady, unwavering gaze, like I was the only thing on the train worth paying attention to. I glanced up, meeting her eyes briefly. She smiled. Not a warm smile, not cold either. More like the kind of smile you'd give someone right before saying something you knew they wouldn't believe. When the train began to move, I looked away. We rattled through 3 stops, the familiar screech and clatter of the subway filling the air, but the woman never stopped staring. She didn't check her phone, didn't glance out the window, didn't even fidget. just sat there with her suitcase resting upright between her knees, hands folded neatly on the handle. I was about to stand up and move to another car, just to get away from her unnerving presence, when she finally spoke. "Do you feel it yet?" Her voice was soft, calm, and completely at odds with the question. I looked at her. "Feel what?" Her smile widened slightly, like she'd been expecting me to say that. "The echo." "Echo?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She tilted her head, the way a person does when they're trying to decide whether you're worth explaining something to. "It always takes longer for some people. It's okay. You'll feel it soon." There wasn't much I could say to that, so I didn't respond. Instead, I looked down at my hands, at the worn edges of my coat sleeves. The air felt different. Thicker, maybe. Heavier. But only now that she'd said something about it. I told myself it was just her weird energy getting to me. When I looked up again, she was no longer holding the suitcase. It was gone. I frowned. I hadn't seen her move, hadn't seen her put it anywhere, and there was no way she'd left it behind in the space of a blink. It wasn't under her seat. It wasn't next to her. It just wasn't there anymore. "Where's your bag?" I asked before I could stop myself. She smiled again, like I'd asked the wrong question on purpose. "It's where it needs to be." "What does that mean?" She didn't answer, but her gaze sharpened, her eyes flickering with something. Recognition, maybe, or regret. I turned away again, clenching my fists. This was stupid. She was probably some eccentric tourist or an artist who thought she was profound. I didn't need to play into it. Just one more stop, and I'd get off and forget this whole thing ever happened. But then I noticed the echo. It was faint at first, just a ripple at the edges of my thoughts, like a memory surfacing without warning. The train car felt too small, the air humming faintly with something I couldn't name. I turned my head toward the windows, and that's when I realized the subway wasn't moving. Not the way it should be, anyway. We weren't in the tunnel anymore. The windows showed something else, something vast, dark, and rippling, like an ocean turned inside out. Shapes moved in the distance, impossibly large, flickering in and out of focus. The kind of shapes that make you feel like an insect standing at the edge of a chasm. I turned back to the woman, panic rising in my chest. "What is this?" She didn't look away from me. "It's where you're going." "I'm not going anywhere," I snapped, my voice echoing too loudly in the stillness of the car. Her expression didn't change. "You already are. You've been heading there for a long time. You just didn't notice until now." I stood up, gripping the pole for balance even though the train wasn't moving. Or maybe it was moving too smoothly to feel. The world outside the windows pulsed faintly, its edges fraying like threads unraveling from a tapestry. "This isn't real," I said, trying to steady my breathing. "It's real enough," she replied. The train jolted, and for a split second, the car was empty. No seats, no ads on the walls, no passengers. Just me, standing in an endless void. The floor of the subway car stretching out into nothingness. And then everything snapped back into place, just as quickly as it had disappeared. Except now, the other passengers were gone. It was just me and her. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It's not about what I want," she said. "It's about what you've forgotten." "What are you talking about?" She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her gaze impossibly heavy. "You left something behind. A choice. A moment. A version of yourself. You traded it away a long time ago, but the echoes are catching up now. And the place we're heading," she gestured toward the windows, where the rippling darkness seemed to press closer. "It's where you'll find it again." "I didn't trade anything," I whispered, shaking my head. "You've got the wrong person." She straightened, her expression softening for the first time. "You all say that at first. It's easier to believe you've been moving forward the whole time. But every step forward leaves a shadow behind." The train screeched to a halt, and the lights flickered, plunging us into brief, suffocating darkness. When the lights came back on, the door at the end of the car was open. Beyond it was not another subway platform, but a staircase spiraling downward, carved from smooth black stone that shimmered faintly, like it was wet. The woman stood in motion toward the door. "It's time." I didn't move. Her voice softened again. You don't have to go. You can stay here, and the train will keep moving. But if you do, the echoes won't stop. They'll follow you, louder and louder, until there's no way forward and no way back. That's the deal you made. What deal? I asked, desperate now. She didn't answer. The hum was back, vibrating through the floor of the train, through my bones, through the spaces between each thought in my head. My feet felt heavy, but they moved anyway, carrying me toward the open door. The staircase yawned before me, impossibly vast, stretching into a darkness that didn't feel empty. The last thing I heard before I stepped through was her voice, calm and steady. Don't forget this time. And then, I began to descend. The first time I saw the man with the briefcase, I was sitting on a bench in the park, eating an overripe peach. It was one of those heavy summer afternoons where the air feels like it's made of molasses, and even the breeze seems half-hearted. I'd been people watching to pass the time. An elderly couple feeding breadcrumbs to pigeons, a jogger wiping sweat from her face, two kids arguing over who got to push the swing next. And then there was him. He wasn't extraordinary at first glance. Average height, average build, dark slacks and a crisp white shirt rolled to the elbows. He wore a tie that had loosened slightly, the way you might after a long meeting. The only thing that stood out about him was the briefcase. It was made of old leather, the kind that darkens at the edges from years of handling, and it was chained to his wrist. Not just looped around, but locked, an actual, heavy-duty chain secured with a small padlock. He carried it carefully, like it was more valuable than gold, or maybe more dangerous. He sat down on the bench across from me, setting the briefcase on his lap. He didn't open it. He didn't check his phone, or look at the pigeons, or seem to notice the world around him at all. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his free hand resting lightly on the top of the case. I don't know why I couldn't stop watching him. Maybe it was the chain. Maybe it was the stillness he carried, like the whole park existed in a different dimension from him. Whatever it was, I was so focused on him that I didn't realize my peach pit had slipped from my fingers until it hit the ground with a dull thud. The sound must have startled him, because his head snapped in my direction. His eyes locked on mine, and for a second, I thought he was going to say something. But he didn't. He just gave me a small, polite nod, then stood and walked away, his shoes clicking softly against the path. I wouldn't have thought about him again if it weren't for what happened the next day. I was on my way to the grocery store, trying to remember if I still had milk in the fridge, when I saw him again. Same man, same briefcase, same chain. He was standing at the corner of 5th and Ash, waiting for the light to change. This time, he wasn't alone. A woman was next to him, wearing a sundress with bright yellow flowers, her hands tucked into the pockets. She was talking to him, her mouth moving quickly, but he wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the briefcase, his face unreadable. I don't know what possessed me, but I slowed down and pretended to check my phone, just so I could watch. The light changed, and they crossed the street together. I followed at a distance, careful not to get too close. They didn't go far, just a block or two, before turning into a small cafe. I lingered outside, debating whether or not to go in. It felt ridiculous, stalking some stranger over a briefcase, but there was something about him that made it impossible to walk away. I eventually decided against following them inside and continued on to the grocery store, feeling both relieved and foolish. But after that, I started seeing him everywhere. On the train, sitting in the far corner with the briefcase balanced on his knees. At the library, standing by the shelves but not reading anything, the chain glinting under the fluorescent lights. Once, late at night, I saw him standing in front of an empty storefront, staring at the reflection of himself and the briefcase in the glass. It wasn't just the briefcase or the chain that caught my attention anymore. It was the pattern. He was always alone, except for that one time with the woman, and he never stayed anywhere for long. He would appear, stay just long enough to be noticed, and then vanish, like he was following a route only he understood. I tried to brush it off. People have quirks. Maybe he was some eccentric millionaire who carried his life savings around in that case. Maybe he was an artist, doing some weird performance piece about capitalism or attachment, or whatever people with too much free time like to think about. But the more I saw him, the harder it became to shake the feeling that whatever he was doing, it wasn't normal. Then, one evening, I found the briefcase. It was late, just after sunset, and I was walking home from a friend's place. The streets were mostly empty, and the air had that faint metallic smell it gets before a storm. I was cutting through the alley behind my apartment building when I saw it, sitting in the middle of the pavement. The briefcase. Same leather, same scuffed edges, but no chain. It was just there, abandoned. I looked around, half expecting to see him lurking in the shadows, but the alley was empty. For a moment, I considered walking away. Whatever was in that case, it wasn't my business. But then I thought about the chain, the way he'd carried it so carefully, the way he'd never let it out of his sight. Why would he leave it here, of all places? Unless he hadn't left it, unless something had happened to him. Before I could talk myself out of it, I stepped closer. The leather was cool under my fingers, and the brass clasp glinted faintly in the fading light. I hesitated, my heart pounding, and then I flipped it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I pulled it out, my hands trembling slightly. The paper was thick, almost like parchment, and covered in small, precise handwriting. It wasn't in English, or in any language I recognized. The letters were strange, looping, and angular at the same time, like a code or a script from some ancient civilization. It should have been meaningless, but as I stared at it, the shapes seemed to shift, arranging themselves into words I could understand. It said, "You weren't supposed to find this." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I dropped the paper, stepping back like it might burn me, but the words kept repeating in my head. "You weren't supposed to find this." My instinct was to run, to leave the briefcase and whatever it was tied to far behind. But something stopped me. A thought. If I wasn't supposed to find it, who was? I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at the briefcase, the paper fluttering slightly in the breeze. Eventually, I picked it up and took it with me. I told myself it was because I wanted to help, because I wanted to figure out what had happened to him. But deep down, I think I already knew. Whatever the briefcase was, whatever it meant, I was part of it now. The man hasn't shown up since that night. I keep expecting to see him on the train, or sitting in the park, or standing at that empty storefront, but he's gone. The briefcase is still in my apartment, sitting in the corner like a question I can't bring myself to answer. I've tried opening it again, but now it's empty. The paper is gone. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the faint sound of chains rattling, but when I check, there's nothing there. I don't know who he was or what he was carrying, but I can't shake the feeling that I've taken his place. And sometimes, when I'm walking through the city, I catch people watching me the way I used to watch him. Their eyes linger just a little too long, their expressions a little too curious. I don't carry a briefcase, but I wonder if they see something I can't. So, tell me, if you found a briefcase chained to someone's wrist, would you want to know what was inside? Or would you leave it alone, knowing that some mysteries are better left unsolved? The letter arrived on my kitchen table, though I never heard anyone knock or slide it through the door. It wasn't there when I went to bed, and when I stumbled out of my bedroom at 6 a.m., bleary-eyed and half asleep, there it was, plain, white, and impossibly ordinary. My name was written on the front in dark blue ink, the letters looping in a way that felt too personal, too knowing. It wasn't stamped, sealed, or folded into an envelope. Just a single piece of paper, folded in thirds, waiting for me like it had always been meant to. I stared at it for a long moment, the kettle humming quietly behind me as water heated for my morning tea. For reasons I couldn't explain, the sight of the letter made my stomach turn. My hands were shaking when I reached for it. I told myself it was just nerves, that maybe it was from my landlord or a neighbor with some complaint I'd forgotten about. But I knew it wasn't. The paper felt cold and smooth, and when I unfolded it, the words were already waiting for me. "Hello, Aiden. You have until tonight." That was all it said. No explanation, no signature, no hint of who had written it or what it meant. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, but not familiar. I read it again, slower this time, as though the words might change if I stared at them long enough. They didn't. I turned the paper over, expecting something, anything, on the other side. It was blank. The kettle clicked off, and I jumped, the sound louder than it should have been. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out everything else as I dropped the paper onto the table like it might burn me. This was nothing. It had to be a prank, some stupid joke, or a mistake. I didn't know anyone who would leave something like this for me. Maybe the name wasn't even meant for me. Aiden wasn't exactly uncommon, but the longer I stared at the letter, the harder it became to convince myself of that. Something about it was too specific, too deliberate. Like it knew me. The way the ink bled slightly into the paper, the faint scent of something metallic clinging to it. It all felt too precise, too real. I told myself to ignore it, to drink my tea, and go about my day. And I did try. I really did. But the words followed me. They lingered in my thoughts as I brushed my teeth, as I fed the cat, as I stared blankly at my inbox trying to muster the energy to answer emails. You have until tonight. Until tonight for what? By the time lunch rolled around, I wasn't hungry. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I checked the windows twice, pulling the curtains tighter, but the street outside was as empty and boring as ever. I almost convinced myself to call someone. My sister, maybe, or that one coworker who always seemed way too interested in everyone's problems. But every time I picked up my phone, I hesitated. What would I even say? Hey, I got this creepy letter. No, it doesn't explain anything. No, I don't know where it came from. Anyway, how's your day going? Instead, I ended up pacing my apartment, half convinced that something would happen. The longer the day dragged on, the more unbearable the silence became. I kept checking the clock, watching the hours crawl by, but nothing changed. No knock at the door. No second letter. No answers. By the time the sun began to set, I'd convinced myself that nothing was going to happen. The whole thing had to be some kind of elaborate prank. Maybe it was a marketing stunt for a movie, or an escape room, or something equally stupid. I laughed. Actually laughed. For the first time all day, shaking my head at my own paranoia. I turned on the TV and let it blare meaningless noise into the room while I sank into the couch with a blanket. And then the lights flickered. It wasn't dramatic. No power surges or sparks or anything like that. Just a faint, brief flicker. Barely noticeable. But the moment it happened, my stomach dropped. The air in the room felt heavier, like a storm was building just outside. The TV screen froze mid-commercial, the sound cutting off abruptly, and in the sudden silence, I heard it. A knock at the door. I didn't move at first. My body refused. Every instinct screamed at me to stay where I was, to pretend I wasn't home, to ignore it and hope it went away. But the knock came again, louder this time, and I knew. I just knew that whoever was on the other side wasn't going to leave until I answered. Slowly, I stood up, my legs shaking as I made my way to the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a brief, panicked moment, I considered not opening it at all. But before I could decide, the door creaked open on its own. No one was there. The hallway was empty, bathed in the soft orange glow of the overhead lights. No shadows, no footsteps, nothing. And then I saw it. The letter. It was sitting on the floor just outside my door, identical to the one I'd found that morning. Same neat folds. Same blue ink spelling out my name. My chest tightened as I picked it up, the weight of it far heavier than it should have been. I unfolded it slowly, my fingers trembling, and read the words written inside. It's time. The air shifted behind me. Cold, sharp, and wrong. I turned around, and everything went dark. When I woke up, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. The room was vast and empty, its walls a pale, featureless gray. There were no windows, no doors, no furniture. Just me, sitting on the floor with the letter still clutched in my hand. The light seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, casting no shadows. The silence was deafening. And then, I wasn't alone. A figure stepped out from the emptiness. Tall, thin, and draped in something that might have been fabric, but moved like liquid smoke. Its face, or the place where a face should have been, was a void, smooth and featureless, reflecting nothing. It stopped a few feet away from me, its head tilting slightly to one side, as though it was studying me. "You came," it said, its voice low and even, with a strange metallic undertone. "I didn't have much of a choice," I said, my voice cracking. The figure nodded, as though that was the answer it had expected. Few do. What do you want from me? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it reached out a hand, long and impossibly thin, and pointed to the letter in my hand. That, it said simply. I looked down at the letter. The paper felt warm now, almost alive, and the words were shifting, rearranging themselves into something new. Choose. Choose what? I whispered. Everything, the figure said. The room around me began to blur, the walls fading into something vast and unknowable. The paper in my hands grew heavier, the words burning themselves into my vision. My pulse pounded in my ears as the figure stepped closer, its voice wrapping around me like a coil. Time doesn't wait, it said. Choose. And so, I did. I first noticed the cracks on a Thursday, not the cracks in the sidewalk or the walls of my apartment. I'd seen those 1,000 times and stepped over them without a thought. No, these cracks were different. They didn't belong to anything. They weren't on the ground, or the ceiling, or any surface at all. They just hung there, in the air, faintly shimmering like heat waves rising off asphalt. The first one was in the corner of my living room. I saw it while I was folding laundry, my arms full of mismatched socks. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the afternoon light coming through the blinds. But when I moved closer, the crack stayed where it was, stubbornly fixed in place. It wasn't big, maybe the length of my forearm, but its edges pulsed faintly, jagged and sharp like splintered glass. I reached out to touch it without thinking, like some instinct buried deep in my brain wanted to see if it was real. The second my fingertips brushed the edge, a sound rushed through my ears, like wind howling through a canyon, or a distant choir all singing the wrong notes. I jerked my hand back, my heart pounding, and stumbled a few steps away. The sound vanished as quickly as it came, leaving my apartment unbearably quiet, like all the noise had been sucked out of the air. I spent the next hour staring at it, trying to convince myself it wasn't real, that it was some optical illusion, a glitch in my brain, a leftover fragment of a dream I couldn't remember. But it didn't go away. Every time I blinked, every time I turned my head, it was still there, faintly pulsing, impossibly solid. That night, I dreamed of water. Endless, dark water stretching out in every direction. I was floating in it, weightless, with no shore in sight. The surface of the water rippled with movement, but I couldn't see what was beneath me. Something brushed against my leg, soft and cold, and when I looked down, the water began to crack. Thin, white fractures spread out beneath me like veins, glowing faintly, and I could hear the same sound from before. The howling wind, the discordant choir, louder this time, almost deafening. I woke up gasping, the sound still ringing in my ears. The crack in my living room wasn't alone anymore. When I stepped out of my bedroom, bleary-eyed and shaking, I saw another one hanging over the kitchen table. This one was bigger, longer, stretching horizontally like a jagged line drawn in midair. Its edges glowed faintly in the pre-dawn light, and the sight of it made my stomach churn. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't. I spent the morning pacing back and forth between the two cracks, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I wanted to call someone, my best friend, my landlord, anyone, but what was I supposed to say? Hi, there's something wrong with the air in my apartment? No one would believe me. I wasn't even sure I believed me. By the afternoon, I decided to leave. I packed a bag with enough clothes to last a few days, shoved my laptop into its case, and headed for the door. But when I opened it, I froze. There was a crack hanging just outside my apartment, hovering in the hallway like it had been waiting for me. This one was different, bigger, wider, and its edges didn't shimmer faintly like the others. They burned, flickering like the edges of a flame, and as I stared at it, I realized I could see something inside it. It wasn't a window, not exactly, but I could see shapes moving beyond the crack, blurry and indistinct, like figures moving behind frosted glass. They weren't human. They couldn't have been. Their limbs were too long, their movements too smooth, and the sight of them made my skin crawl. The sound came back. That same howling, that same off-key choir, louder this time, so loud it felt like it was coming from inside my head. I slammed the door shut, dropping my bag, and pressed my back against the wood. My pulse was hammering so hard it felt like my heart was trying to claw its way out of my chest. I stayed there for hours, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, the cracks were everywhere. There was one in the bathroom mirror, one hanging above my bed, one stretched across the ceiling like a lightning strike frozen mid-flash. They were multiplying, growing, spreading like a virus through the air itself. I couldn't escape them. No matter where I went in the apartment, I could see them out of the corner of my eye, glowing faintly, humming faintly, watching. The worst part wasn't the sound or the sight of the cracks. It was the feeling. Every time I got close to one, I felt like I was being pulled toward it, like there was a thread buried somewhere in my chest that the cracks were tugging on. It wasn't a physical pull, not exactly, but it was strong, so strong that it took every ounce of willpower I had to stay away. Part of me wanted to let it happen, to step closer, to see what would happen if I reached out and touched one again. I didn't, but I think I know what would have happened, because last night, I watched one open. It was the one over the kitchen table. The air around it started to shimmer, the edges burning brighter and brighter until I had to shield my eyes. And then, slowly, the crack began to widen. It wasn't a rip or a tear. It was more like a door opening, smooth and deliberate, and as it widened, the sound grew louder. The howling, the choir, and something else. Something underneath it all, like a low, rumbling growl that made the floor tremble beneath my feet. The space beyond the crack wasn't empty. It was dark, yes, but not the kind of darkness you get when the lights are off. It was alive, shifting, filled with movement. I could see shadows writhing inside it, shapes twisting and unfurling like smoke, and for the first time, I felt something push through. It wasn't a hand. Not exactly, but it reached, stretching out from the darkness, long and thin and jagged, like a shard of obsidian come to life. The edges of it glinted in the dim light, and I could feel it searching, feel it reaching for me. I didn't stay to see what would happen next. I don't know how I managed to run. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, moving on instinct while my brain screamed at me to stop, to hide, to do anything but leave. But I couldn't stay there. I bolted out the door and down the stairs, not caring if there were cracks in the hallway, not caring about anything except putting as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. Now I'm sitting in a cafe across town, my bag at my feet, my hands trembling around a cup of coffee that's gone cold. I don't know what to do. The cracks are following me. I know they are. I can feel it, that same tugging in my chest, pulling me towards something I don't understand. I think the cracks are everywhere. I think they've always been everywhere, and I just wasn't paying attention. There's one in the corner of this cafe. It's small, barely a hairline fracture in the air, but I can see it. I can hear it, and it's getting bigger. There's a painting in my building's basement. Nobody talks about it, but everyone knows it's there. It hangs on the far wall of the laundry room, just above the row of dented dryers that are always either broken or running too loud. The painting itself is simple. A dimly lit forest, thick with trees whose twisting branches reach upward like hands. There's a single path winding through the forest, disappearing into darkness somewhere near the center. It's not signed, not framed. Just a piece of canvas nailed haphazardly to the wall, as if someone had decided the laundry room needed art but didn't want to put any effort into it. When I first moved in, I didn't think much about it. It was just there, like the scuffed linoleum or the weird mildew smell that never quite went away. The landlord didn't mention it during the tour, and I didn't ask. Who cares about a random painting in a basement? At the time, it barely registered. The first time I really noticed it was on a Tuesday night, when I went downstairs to switch my laundry over. The dryers were all in use, so I sat down on the cracked plastic bench to wait. That's when I felt it. The painting was behind me, but I swear I could feel it, like it was watching me. Not in a literal way. There were no eyes hidden in the shadows of the trees, no sinister faces etched into the bark. But the sensation was undeniable, this creeping awareness that I wasn't alone. I turned around, half expecting to find someone standing there, but it was just the painting, silent and still. Something was different, though. The path. I could have sworn it hadn't been there the last time I looked at it. Or maybe it had, but it seemed longer now, like it stretched further into the woods, vanishing deeper into the dark. I laughed it off, chalking it up to my imagination. It's a painting. Paintings don't change. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been waiting for me to notice it. Over the next few weeks, I found excuses to avoid the laundry room. I told myself it was because of the broken dryers, or the flickering fluorescent lights, or the way the basement always smelled faintly of damp cardboard. But deep down, I knew it was the painting. I didn't want to see it again. Didn't want to feel its quiet, heavy presence pressing against me like a hand on my shoulder. I started doing my laundry late at night, when I thought no one else would be around, rushing through the whole process as quickly as I could. But the painting wouldn't leave me alone. I began dreaming about it. The forest from the painting would stretch out in front of me, endless and unnervingly quiet, its trees swaying in a wind I couldn't feel. I would stand at the edge of the path, staring into the dark, unable to move. There was no sound, no birds or insects or rustling leaves, just silence, thick and suffocating. And always, in the distance, a faint light flickering between the trees, like it was calling to me. I never walked the path in those dreams, but I always woke up with the feeling that I had been close. Too close. One night, after weeks of avoiding the basement, I finally gave in. My laundry basket was overflowing, and I couldn't put it off any longer. I went downstairs, keeping my eyes firmly on the floor as I loaded my clothes into the washer. I told myself I wouldn't look at it. I wouldn't even glance in its direction. But as I sat there waiting for the cycle to finish, I felt it again. That undeniable pull, like the painting was daring me to turn around. I tried to ignore it. I pulled out my phone, scrolling aimlessly, but my hands were shaking too much to focus. Finally, I gave up. I turned. The painting had changed. The path was even longer now, winding deeper into the woods, its edges blurred like it was being swallowed by the shadows. The trees looked different, too, thicker, darker. Their branches tangled together like they were alive. And there, in the distance, was the light from my dreams, faint but unmistakable, glowing between the trees. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and for the first time, I noticed something else. Footprints, tiny, faint impressions in the dirt of the path, leading toward the light. My own footprints. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the bench. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. I hadn't walked the path. I hadn't even touched the painting. But there they were, as clear as if I'd left them myself. I ran upstairs without finishing my laundry. That night, I locked my door and shoved a chair under the knob, as if that could protect me from whatever this was. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the painting, felt its pull dragging me closer and closer to the edge of the forest. I thought about leaving, about packing up my stuff and moving far away, but something told me it wouldn't matter. The painting would find me again. It always did. The next day, I went back to the basement. I don't know why. Maybe I thought confronting it would help. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that it wasn't real. But when I got there, the painting was gone. The wall was bare, the nails still sticking out where the canvas had hung. I searched the entire basement, pulling open closets and checking behind boxes, but it wasn't there. It was like it had never existed. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived, because as I turned to leave, I saw them. Footprints, leading across the dusty floor and disappearing into the shadows of the far corner. My heart sank. I knew without a doubt that they weren't mine. That night, the dream was different. I wasn't standing at the edge of the forest anymore. I was on the path, walking slowly toward the flickering light. The trees loomed over me, their branches whispering in a language I couldn't understand, and the silence was thicker than ever, pressing against my ears until I thought they might burst. I wanted to stop, to turn around, but my feet kept moving, drawn forward by something I couldn't fight. And then, as the light grew brighter, I saw it. A door. It was tall and narrow, made of dark, weathered wood, with no handle or hinges. The light spilled out from the cracks around its edges, pulsing like a heartbeat. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the surface, and for a moment, I felt warmth. Then the dream ended. When I woke up, I wasn't in my bed. I was standing in the basement, barefoot, my hand pressed against the bare wall where the painting had hung. My laundry basket was still there, my clothes untouched in the washer. And on the floor, leading away from where I stood, were footprints. They weren't mine. I don't go into the basement anymore. I do my laundry at the laundromat down the street, even though it's more expensive and less convenient. But it doesn't matter. The dreams keep coming. The door is always there, waiting for me. The light spilling out from its edges, growing brighter every night. You ever feel like something is waiting for you? Like no matter how far you run, it'll find you, because it's not chasing you. It's just waiting for you to catch up. There's a man who sits in my apartment building's lobby every Tuesday. He's always there, without fail, in the same threadbare armchair near the elevator. He wears a gray suit that might have been fashionable 40 years ago, a hat with a slightly dented brim, and polished shoes that look just a bit too shiny for someone sitting in a dusty lobby. He doesn't read, doesn't check his phone, doesn't even seem to fidget. He just sits there, hands resting on a wooden cane, as though he's waiting for something, or someone. I first noticed him about 3 months ago. At the time, I thought he might be one of the retirees who lived in the building, a quirky older gentleman who liked to people watch. But something about him was off. For one thing, he never seemed to age. His face was lined, sure, but in a timeless way, like a photograph frozen in sepia tones. And no matter how hot or cold it was outside, he always wore the same suit, looking neither sweaty in July nor chilled in November. The most unsettling thing, though, was that I never saw him leave. I'd come home from work around 6, and there he'd be, sitting in his chair. Then, when I'd leave for a late-night errand or come down to grab my mail, he'd still be there, sitting perfectly still, staring straight ahead. I asked the building manager about him once, just a casual, "Hey, who's the guy in the suit?" But she gave me a puzzled look and said she hadn't noticed anyone. That was when I decided to stop asking. But last Tuesday, everything changed. I'd worked late and came home exhausted, juggling my laptop bag, a grocery bag, and a coffee I'd regretted buying the second I tasted it. When I stepped into the lobby, there he was again, sitting in his chair like always. Only this time, his head turned ever so slightly as I walked by. It wasn't much, just a small movement, a tilt in my direction, but it was enough to make me freeze mid-step. He had never acknowledged me before. Not once. I turned to face him, clutching my bags like they were some kind of shield. "Evening," he said. His voice was low and smooth, with the kind of calm authority you only hear in old black and white movies. He nodded at me, his hat casting a shadow over his eyes. "You're late." I blinked. "Late for what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "For the elevator," he replied, as though it were obvious. I glanced at the elevator. The doors were open, but no one was inside. The light above it was dimmer than usual, flickering faintly, casting strange shadows on the floor. "I'm not late," I said, feeling a little ridiculous for arguing. "I'm just going upstairs." The man gave a small, knowing smile. "That's what they all say." "What do you mean, they?" I asked. "Who are you?" Instead of answering, he tapped the floor with his cane. Once, twice, and gestured toward the elevator. "Go on. It won't wait forever." Against my better judgment, I stepped into the elevator, my bags weighing heavy in my hands. I turned to press the button for my floor, but the panel was blank. No numbers, no emergency button, just smooth, featureless metal. The doors slid shut behind me, and for a moment, I thought I might have stepped into the wrong building entirely. "Excuse me," I called through the doors. "I think this thing is broken." The man didn't reply. Instead, the elevator shuddered, and the world tilted. When the doors opened again, I wasn't on my floor, or any floor I recognized. I was standing in the middle of what looked like a train station, though it wasn't any station I'd ever seen. The walls were made of dark stone, veined with gold that pulsed faintly, as though alive. The ceiling arched high above me, disappearing into shadows, and the air smelled faintly of ozone, like the moment before a lightning strike. The station was silent, but not empty. Figures moved in and out of the shadows, Men and women, children and elders, all walking with the same purpose. But their features were wrong, like something out of a dream. Their faces flickered, shifting between familiar and unfamiliar, as though they wore borrowed masks. Their movements were smooth, almost liquid, and their eyes, when I caught a glimpse of them, shimmered with an unsettling silver light. Where am I? I whispered, clutching the doorframe of the elevator for support. A voice spoke from behind me. The station between moments. I turned to see the man from the lobby, stepping out of the elevator as though he'd been there the entire time. He didn't have his cane anymore, and his posture was straighter, his presence more commanding. The what? I asked, my voice trembling. He gestured around us. This is where the lost moments go. The choices you didn't make. The roads you didn't take. The seconds that slipped through your fingers. I stared at him, uncomprehending. That doesn't make any sense. I didn't. You've been here before, he interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. You just don't remember. I think I'd remember this, I said, my voice rising in frustration. I've never. Before I could finish, the station shifted. The walls rippled, the golden veins glowing brighter, and suddenly, I was no longer standing on the platform. I was in a small cafe, the kind I used to frequent in college. The smell of coffee and cinnamon filled the air, and the faint murmur of conversation surrounded me. At a corner table, I saw myself, years younger, hair tied back, staring out the window with a wistful look on my face. Across from her, across from me, sat a man. His face flickered, blurring and sharpening like the others I'd seen in the station, but there was something familiar about him. He was talking, leaning forward, his hands gesturing as he spoke, but the younger me wasn't paying attention. She was distracted, staring at her phone, nodding absently without really hearing him. The man's face twisted with disappointment, and he stood up, leaving his coffee half-finished. My younger self didn't even notice until the bell above the door jingled, and by then, it was too late. She looked up, her expression shifting from confusion to regret, and then the memory dissolved. I was back in the station, the man from the lobby watching me with an unreadable expression. What was that? I asked, my voice breaking. Why did you show me that? That, he said, was a moment you lost. I didn't lose it, I said defensively. It was just life. Things happen. People come and go. Do they? He asked, tilting his head. Or do you let them go? I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came. There are more, he said, gesturing toward the station. If you're ready. I wasn't ready. Not even close. But the figures were moving again, their faces flickering, their silver eyes watching. And the station between moments waited, endless and silent, ready to show me everything I didn't want to see. The first time I saw Evelyn, she was dragging an office chair through a park, muttering to herself like she was solving an advanced physics equation. It was one of those quiet Sunday mornings when the world felt like it hadn't fully woken up yet. I was on my usual jog, headphones in, music blaring, when I caught sight of her. A petite figure with messy hair, wearing a tattered sweatshirt that said, "Birds are liars," hauling a beaten-up office chair across the grass like it was some great beast she'd hunted down. The wheels of the chair kept catching on patches of dirt and grass, and every few feet, she'd stop, glare at it, and yank harder. I slowed down, because who wouldn't? It's not every day you see someone waging war with office furniture in the middle of a public park. She noticed me staring and paused, pushing the hair out of her face with a huff. "It's not what it looks like," she said, which immediately made me even more curious. "What does it look like?" I asked, pulling out my headphones. "Like I'm crazy," she replied, then frowned. "Okay, maybe a little crazy, but it's purposeful crazy." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to elaborate. She sighed, gestured dramatically at the chair, and said, "I'm building a mobile thinking station." "A what?" "You know, a place to sit and think, but mobile, so I can roll it to wherever the good ideas are." I blinked. "And you decided an office chair was the solution?" "Of course," she said, like it was the most logical thing in the world. "It has wheels. Mobility is key." I couldn't argue with her confidence, but I also couldn't figure out if she was completely unhinged or some kind of eccentric genius. Before I could decide, she pointed at me and said, "You're strong. Help me carry this thing to the path." Now, I don't usually take orders from strangers in parks, especially ones dragging furniture, but there was something about her, a mix of determination and absurdity, that made it impossible to say no. So I jogged over, grabbed one side of the chair, and helped her lift it onto the paved path. "Thanks," she said, brushing dirt off the seat. "What's your name?" "Leo," I said. "Yours?" "Evelyn." She shook my hand with the kind of firmness that suggested she was trying to outdo me. "Nice to meet you, Leo. You're officially part of history now." "History?" She climbed into the chair, sat cross-legged, and gave an exaggerated wave, as though addressing an imaginary crowd. "The inaugural role of the mobile thinking station. People will write about this someday." I laughed before I could stop myself. "You're not serious." "Of course I'm serious. It's groundbreaking." She grabbed the armrests, leaned back dramatically, and said, "Now, push me. Push you. Push me." Every maiden voyage needs a little momentum. And somehow, I did it. I pushed Evelyn in that ridiculous office chair down the path, her laughter echoing through the quiet park. People stared. A couple walking their dog actually stopped to watch, and a kid on a scooter gave us a thumbs up. Evelyn waved at everyone like she was in a parade, her grin as wide as the sky. When the path sloped downward, I let go, and she rolled a good 20 feet before crashing into a bench. She stumbled out of the chair, brushing herself off like she'd just disembarked from a roller coaster, and said, "Not bad for a first attempt." "Not bad? You almost took out a bench." She shrugged. "That's innovation for you. Messy but worth it." I thought that would be the last I saw of her, but of course it wasn't. A week later, I was back at the park for another jog when I spotted her again. This time sitting in the same chair under a tree, surrounded by a pile of books, sketch pads, and what looked like a plate of cookies. She was holding a magnifying glass and inspecting something intently. "Hey, it's the thinking station guy," she called out when she saw me. I jogged over, hands on my hips, and nodded at the mess around her. "You've upgraded." "Obviously," she said, gesturing at the cookies. "Every good workspace needs snacks. What are you doing now?" "Cataloging bugs," she said, holding up a mason jar with a grasshopper inside. "I'm thinking about writing a book." "A book about bugs?" No. A book about perspective. Bugs are just the inspiration. They see the world differently, you know? Imagine being an inch tall. Everything would be terrifying and amazing at the same time. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just sat down next to her. She handed me a cookie without asking if I wanted one, and we ended up talking for an hour. About bugs, books, and why she thought humans had forgotten how to notice the little things. Evelyn had a way of making even the strangest ideas sound like revelations. She'd say things like, "Have you ever wondered why grass feels softer after it rains?" Or, "Do you think trees get bored standing in one place all the time?" And somehow, instead of rolling my eyes, I found myself genuinely considering her questions. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn became a regular fixture in my life. I'd see her in the park almost every morning, either sitting in her thinking station or wandering around with some new project in hand. Once, she convinced me to help her build a temporary library by stacking books on the steps of the fountain. Another time, she brought a kite she'd made out of trash bags and string and spent an hour trying to get it airborne while yelling, "You're too heavy, you stubborn piece of art." She was chaos, pure and simple, but she made life feel lighter, less predictable. One day, she asked me why I came to the park so often. "To run," I said. "It clears my head." She frowned, tapping her chin like she was dissecting my answer. "That's so linear. Running is fine. But don't you ever just sit? Watch the way the light shifts through the trees. Listen to the sound of people living?" "I'm not great at sitting still," I admitted. "Well, that's your problem," she said, poking me in the arm. "You're too busy moving forward to notice where you are." The thing about Evelyn was that she never said anything with malice. Even her criticisms felt like gifts, little invitations to rethink how you saw the world. It took me a while to figure out why she'd left such a big impression on me. She wasn't conventionally inspiring. She didn't have some big, tragic backstory or an impossibly ambitious dream. But Evelyn had a talent for finding meaning in the mundane. She didn't wait for life to give her extraordinary moments. She created them out of whatever scraps she had on hand. She taught me how to sit still, how to appreciate the feeling of sunlight on my face or the sound of wind brushing through leaves, how to turn an ordinary office chair into a vehicle for adventure. I don't know where Evelyn came from or how long she'll stick around, but I'm glad I found her, or rather, that she found me. She's the kind of person who makes you question everything you thought you knew about how the world works. And, more importantly, she makes you laugh while you're doing it. I once found a clock in a place no clock had any business being. It was late, well past midnight, and I was walking home from the bar down the back alleys that crisscrossed my neighborhood. I always took the long way when I needed to clear my head, and that night I had plenty to clear. The streets were dead quiet, the world caught in that eerie, frozen moment before the city wakes up again. I'd been thinking about something stupid, a fight I'd had with my brother earlier in the week. One of those petty arguments that feels massive in the moment but dissolves into nothing when you try to explain it later. I can't even remember what started it now. All I knew was that it left me buzzing with frustration, and my feet had carried me down an unfamiliar alley in the hopes that maybe walking far enough would shake the feeling loose. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just junk. The alley was lined with the usual urban detritus. Overflowing dumpsters, crumpled beer cans, a broken office chair someone had dumped months ago. But in the dim glow of a single, flickering streetlight, something stood out. It was propped against the wall between two dumpsters, a clock. Not a wristwatch or a digital alarm clock. This was a full-blown, ornate grandfather clock. It looked wildly out of place, standing tall and dignified in the grime of the alley. The wood was dark and polished, its surface gleaming faintly in the streetlight. The face was intricate, with elegant brass hands and Roman numerals that looked hand-carved. It should have been in someone's fancy living room, not leaning against a brick wall next to a pile of soggy cardboard. I stopped in front of it, half expecting it to be some kind of elaborate prank, but no one was around. The street was empty, the silence so thick I could hear the faint hum of the streetlight buzzing above me. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring, and then I noticed something strange. The clock wasn't ticking. Its hands were frozen at 11:14. The pendulum inside was perfectly still, as though the entire mechanism had been paused mid-motion. I leaned in closer, squinting at the face. That's when I saw the inscription. It was etched just below the Roman numeral 6, so faint I wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't been looking for it. 1 wish for 1 hour. I laughed under my breath, the sound loud in the empty alley. It was ridiculous, obviously. Some weird art project, maybe, or just graffiti carved by a bored kid. But something about it made me pause. 1 wish for 1 hour. I reached out, brushing my fingers against the smooth wood of the casing. It was cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so, and for a moment, I hesitated. But the fight with my brother was still echoing in my head, the words I shouldn't have said looping like a broken record, and before I could think better of it, I turned the minute hand forward. The clock gave a low, resonant chime that seemed to ripple through the air, and suddenly, the world shifted. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the usual quiet of the city at night, but an oppressive, absolute silence, like the air had been sucked out of the alley. The streetlight above me flickered once and went out, plunging everything into darkness. When I looked back at the clock, the face was glowing faintly, the Roman numerals casting long, shadowy shapes onto the brick wall behind it. The hands had moved. They now pointed to 12:14, and the pendulum had begun to swing, slow and deliberate, back and forth. And then the voice came. It wasn't loud, but it filled the space, wrapping around me like the scent of something you can't quite place. It wasn't coming from the clock, exactly. It was just there, in the air. "Your hour has begun," it said, calm and steady. "What do you wish?" I froze, my mind blank. I hadn't thought this far ahead. 1 wish. The idea of it suddenly felt too big, too overwhelming. Like trying to fit an ocean into a teacup. I started, but the voice cut me off. "You have until the clock strikes again," it said. Use the hour, or waste it. And then it was gone. The silence pressed in again, and I stood there, staring at the clock, my thoughts spinning in every direction. The obvious answer was to wish for something big. Money, fame, success, whatever it is people dream about when they think no one's watching. But none of it felt right. It all felt too shallow, too easy. The pendulum swung, its slow, rhythmic motion hypnotic. I could feel time slipping away, 1 second at a time, and I panicked. I wish I hadn't fought with my brother, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. The clock didn't respond. The pendulum kept swinging, and for a moment, I thought nothing had happened. But then I felt it. The memory shifted. Not in a dramatic, movie-like way. There was no flash of light, no rewind effect. It just changed. The fight wasn't gone, exactly, but it was different. Softer. Less raw. I remembered apologizing, laughing awkwardly as we tried to move past it. The sting of it faded, replaced by something lighter. For a moment, relief washed over me. But then the voice returned, soft and steady, curling around the edges of my thoughts. You've used your wish. What will you do with the rest of your hour? The question stopped me cold. The rest of my hour. I looked at the clock, its hands inching forward with deliberate slowness. The idea of an hour had never felt so fragile, so impossibly finite. I had time, a whole hour, and for once, I felt the weight of it. I walked, not away from the clock, exactly. It was still there, a constant presence at the edge of my awareness, but through the alley, through the streets, through the city that suddenly felt sharper and more alive than it had in years. The quiet wasn't gone, but it was different now, less suffocating. I thought about all the time I'd wasted, on arguments, on holding on to things I should have let go of, on fear, on hesitation, on waiting for the right moment that never came. The hour slipped by faster than I wanted it to. When I finally made my way back to the alley, the clock's hands were inching toward 12:14 again, its pendulum slowing with each swing. The voice came one last time, softer now, almost distant. Your hour is over. The pendulum stopped. The glow faded. And just like that, the clock was silent again, frozen at 11:14, as though nothing had ever happened. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, waiting for something more. But the alley was just an alley again, and the world around me felt impossibly, unbearably ordinary. I don't know why I found the clock, or why it let me turn its hands, but ever since that night, I felt the weight of every hour, every minute, every second. Time doesn't wait, doesn't pause, doesn't care what you do with it. But sometimes, if you're lucky, it lets you see how much it's worth. Lena first noticed the man at the bus stop on a Tuesday. He was standing under the flickering streetlight, wearing a jacket too heavy for the mild evening and gripping a briefcase that looked out of place. She had walked this route every evening for years, weaving through the same blocks of muted houses and parked cars, and she knew everyone who waited there. The woman with the twin boys and strollers, the elderly man with the patched tweed coat, the teenage girl who always had her headphones in. But this man was new. He stood too still, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the road as though waiting for something far more important than a bus. The oddness of it stayed with her long after she passed him, trailing her up the stairs to her apartment and into the routine of her evening. By the time she was brushing her teeth, she'd nearly forgotten the moment, until she glanced out her bathroom window and saw him standing across the street, just outside the glow of the lamppost. Her toothbrush clattered into the sink. The next morning, he was gone. She almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. But when Lena left for work, she noticed faint indentations in the grass where he must have stood, the kind of small evidence that erodes denial. She walked faster that day, checking over her shoulder as she turned every corner. The man wasn't at the bus stop again until Friday. This time, he was wearing the same jacket, his hands jammed into the pockets as though the briefcase had never existed. Lena's footsteps faltered as she approached the stop, and for a split second, she considered crossing the street to avoid him. But something about his stillness anchored her curiosity in place. She tightened her grip on her bag and continued forward. When she passed him, she caught a brief glimpse of his face. Sharp, pale, framed by dark hair that seemed too precise, too neatly arranged. His eyes, gray and dull, didn't meet hers, but they flicked toward her just enough to make her stomach tighten. She looked away quickly, her pace quickening as her pulse thudded in her ears. By the time she reached the corner, she glanced back and found the street empty. No man, no bus, just the dull hum of the city settling into twilight. It wasn't until the following week that the pattern began to shift. On Monday, Lena found another briefcase at the bus stop, identical to the one the man had carried the first night. This time, it was sitting on the bench. She paused, her instinct to avoid touching it clashing with the irrational certainty that it was meant for her. The street was empty, the air unusually still, and the longer she stared at the briefcase, the more it seemed to hum faintly, like a low vibration just below the edge of hearing. Against her better judgment, she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle, covered in words written in an uneven, jagged hand. The language was unfamiliar, symbols and patterns that felt wrong, as though they were meant for something other than human eyes. And yet, as Lena stared at them, the shapes shifted and rearranged, aligning into words she could suddenly understand. Do not follow him. The breath caught in her throat. She slammed the briefcase shut and stumbled backward, the world tilting slightly as a wave of nausea rolled through her. The street around her felt brighter, sharper, as if every detail had been magnified. She shoved the briefcase aside and ran, not stopping until she reached the safety of her apartment. That night, she dreamed of the man. He was standing in the center of her living room, his stillness more menacing in the confined space. His gray eyes stared directly at her now, empty and endless, pulling at the edges of her thoughts. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy, pinned to the floor by some unseen force. The man didn't speak, but the silence between them was deafening, filled with a presence that made her chest ache. When she woke, the pressure lingered, her breath shallow and uneven as she stared at the shadows on her ceiling. The next day, Lena avoided the bus stop. She took a longer route home, looping through unfamiliar streets and ducking into brightly lit stores to steady herself. But no matter how far she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, her own footsteps echoing back at her in patterns that didn't match her pace. By the time she reached her building, she was trembling. The man was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, his hands in his pockets and his gaze fixed on her. This time, he spoke. "You shouldn't have opened it." The words sent a cold shock through her spine. His voice was low, flat, and it carried no emotion, as though it had been stripped bare of any humanity. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice breaking. His head tilted slightly, a movement so slow it felt deliberate. "It wasn't meant for you." "Then why was it there?" she snapped, anger flaring against her fear. He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking in an instant, though she hadn't seen him move. "You're asking the wrong questions," he said softly. "It's already begun." Before she could respond, he vanished. Not into the shadows, not into a doorway. He was simply gone, as though the air had folded over him and erased his existence. Lena stumbled up the stairs, her heart pounding, and locked herself inside her apartment. For days, the man didn't appear. But the city felt different now, its familiar rhythms distorted. People on the streets moved in strange, jerky patterns, their faces blurred at the edges when she tried to focus on them. Streetlights flickered in unison, casting long, rippling shadows that followed her home. And every night, the dreams returned, growing sharper, more vivid, until she woke with the sensation that she was carrying pieces of them into the waking world. On the seventh night, Lena woke to find the briefcase on her kitchen table. She hadn't brought it inside. She hadn't even touched it since that first night. But there it was, its presence as solid and impossible as the man who haunted her dreams. This time, the note inside was shorter. "Leave before the hour turns. It is coming." A chill swept through her. She didn't need to ask what it was. Something deep in her bones already knew. She grabbed the briefcase and ran, her bare feet slapping against the cold tile as she tore through the door and into the hallway. The air outside her apartment was thick, buzzing faintly like static. The walls seemed to lean inward, the fluorescent lights overhead dimming with every step. At the end of the hall, a shadow waited. Something too large to be human, its form shifting and splintering like smoke caught in a windless space. Lena didn't stop. She ran past the thing, her lungs burning as she threw herself down the stairwell and into the street. Behind her, the buzzing grew louder, a low, resonant hum that followed her through the city's winding streets. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The world around her had already begun to unravel, and she knew that if she stopped, if she so much as glanced over her shoulder, it would take her, too. When I was 6 years old, I used to play in a field behind my grandmother's house. It wasn't a special field, just an expanse of tall grass, some wildflowers here and there, and a single, gnarled oak tree standing in the center like it had been left there by mistake. The kind of place that feels like it's yours when you're a kid, even though no one owns a patch of grass and weeds. I'd spend hours running through the stalks, pretending I was an explorer or a knight or whatever story popped into my head that day. But the tree was different. Even as a kid, I felt like the tree didn't belong in the stories I told myself. It belonged to something else. There was a hollow in the base of the trunk, wide enough for me to crawl into if I'd wanted to, though I never did. It was always filled with damp leaves and spiderwebs, and the thought of sticking my hand inside made my skin crawl. But one day, after a storm had passed through, I noticed something strange. A piece of wood, thin and splintered, was sticking out of the hollow, like someone had jammed it into the tree. I was curious. Of course I was. Kids can't resist something that doesn't quite fit. So I reached in, careful not to touch the webs, and pulled it out. It wasn't just a piece of wood. It was a box. A small, rectangular box made of smooth, dark timber, with tiny carvings along the edges that looked almost like letters, though they weren't in any alphabet I recognized. It didn't have a lock or a hinge, just a lid that fit so tightly it was hard to open. When I finally pried it loose, I found a single playing card inside. It wasn't like any card I'd ever seen. The back was plain black, with no pattern, no border. The front showed a picture, hand-drawn in black ink. A boy standing in a field, surrounded by tall grass. He looked like me. Same messy hair, same striped shirt, even the way he stood, with his arms dangling awkwardly at his sides like he wasn't sure what to do with them. But the longer I stared at it, the more I noticed something off about the picture. In the distance, behind the boy, was the oak tree, and in the hollow of the tree, there were eyes. I didn't tell anyone about the box. I didn't want to explain why I'd been sticking my hand into dark places full of spiders, and, honestly, I didn't know how to explain the card without sounding crazy. So I hid it under my bed, behind a shoebox filled with old action figures. For a while, I forgot about it. Life went on, like it always does. My parents picked me up from my grandmother's at the end of summer, and the field became a memory, something I thought about only when I was bored or feeling nostalgic. I didn't think about the box again until years later. I was 17 when I saw it again. My grandmother had passed away a few months earlier, and my parents were selling her house. They sent me over with a list of things to clear out of the attic. Old books, some mismatched furniture, boxes of photos. The attic was hot and musty, filled with that strange, nostalgic smell of dust and time. I worked for a couple of hours, stacking and sorting, until I found a small trunk wedged into a corner behind some broken chairs. It was locked, but the lock had rusted through, and it popped open easily when I tugged at it. Inside was the box. It was exactly as I remembered it. The dark wood, the tiny carvings along the edges. My hands shook as I opened it, and sure enough, the card was still inside. But it wasn't the same card. This one showed a man standing in the field, older now, his shoulders broader, his hair shaggier. The tree was still there, but the hollow had grown wider, deeper. And in the darkness of the hollow, there was a shape, a hand, pale and thin, reaching out. I closed the box quickly, my heart racing. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, that I was imagining things. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. The box had been under my bed for years. I hadn't touched it since I was a kid. How had it ended up in my grandmother's attic? And why had the card changed? I took the box home with me, though I couldn't say why. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to bury it somewhere no one would ever find it. But another part of me, the part that had always been curious, couldn't let it go. I put it in my closet, on the highest shelf, and tried not to think about it. For a while, it worked. Months passed, then a year, and the box stayed hidden, forgotten. Until the dreams started. They were always the same. I was standing in the field, surrounded by tall grass that swayed in a wind I couldn't feel. The tree loomed in the distance, its branches twisted and bare, even though the rest of the field was lush and green. I knew I shouldn't go near it, but I couldn't stop myself. My feet moved on their own, carrying me closer and closer until I was standing in front of the hollow. Inside, something stirred, something dark and shifting, with too many limbs and too many eyes. It reached for me, and I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The dreams came every night, each one more vivid than the last. I started to notice things in my waking life, too, shadows in the corners of my room, faint whispers that vanished as soon as I tried to listen. I knew it had to be the box, but I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. It felt like it had attached itself to me, like it wouldn't let me go even if I tried. The last dream was different. In this one, I wasn't alone. There was someone else in the field, a figure standing far away, almost hidden by the grass. I called out, but they didn't answer. I walked toward them, my steps slow and heavy, until I could see their face. It was me. Not the me I was now, but the boy I'd been when I first found the box. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, his hands clenched at his sides. "You have to go back," he said, his voice shaking. "You have to put it back." I woke up with those words echoing in my head. I didn't hesitate this time. I grabbed the box from the closet, shoved it into my backpack, and drove to my grandmother's house. It was late, past midnight, and the neighborhood was dark and silent. The house was empty now, the yard overgrown, but the field was still there, just as I remembered it. The tree stood in the center, its branches twisting against the night sky. The hollow gaped like an open mouth, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving inside. My hands trembled as I pulled the box from my bag and crouched in front of the hollow. The air felt heavy, pressing down on my chest, but I forced myself to reach out and slide the box back into the darkness. The moment I did, the air shifted, the weight lifted, and the whispers in my head went silent. I stepped back, staring at the tree, half expecting something to happen, but nothing did. The box was gone, and the field was just a field again. I don't know what the box was, or why it found me, or why it let me go. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see the tree, the hollow, the hand reaching out, and I wonder if it's still waiting, buried in the dark, for someone else to find it. There's a phenomenon I've come to call the flicker. It's not a scientific term. Nothing about it feels measurable or academic, but it's the only word that fits. It's that moment when the world seems to stutter, just for a fraction of a second, like a skipped frame in a film. You're sitting in a cafe, and the waiter walks past your table twice, even though he should have only gone by once. You're in the middle of a conversation, and suddenly it feels like the other person has repeated the same sentence, but not in a natural way. More like someone hit rewind and played it again. Exactly the same, down to the inflection. It's the kind of thing you can dismiss if it happens once. A trick of the light, a lapse in attention. But when it keeps happening, you start to wonder. The first time I noticed the flicker was 3 months ago, when I was walking home from work. It was late, and the streets were quiet in the way they always are when the city finally exhales after a long day. I cut through the park, like I usually do, and saw a man sitting on one of the benches. He was wearing a gray coat and a scarf, reading a book under the glow of a flickering lamppost. I didn't think much of it, but then, about 20 yards further down the path, I saw him again. Same gray coat, same scarf, same book. He was sitting on a completely different bench, but he was in the exact same pose, the light from another lamppost flickering in the exact same pattern. I froze, staring at him, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. I thought about turning back to check the first bench, but something stopped me. Some primal instinct told me I didn't want to know. So I kept walking, faster this time, and when I reached the edge of the park, I glanced back. Both benches were empty. I didn't tell anyone about it. How could I? Hey, I saw the same guy twice, sitting in two different places at the same time. Isn't exactly a conversation starter. Besides, I convinced myself it was just fatigue. A trick of my tired mind. Nothing more. But then it happened again. And again. A week after the park, I was at the grocery store, standing in the cereal aisle, debating whether to buy the off-brand granola or splurge on the name-brand stuff. A man in a red hoodie walked past me, pushing a cart full of frozen dinners. He had this distinctive limp, his right leg dragging slightly behind the left. I watched him disappear around the corner and went back to staring at the shelves. Not 30 seconds later, he walked past me again, heading in the same direction as before, with the same limp, pushing the same cart. This time, I followed him. I turned the corner just in time to see him vanish into thin air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like watching a shadow dissolve into sunlight. One moment, he was there, moving down the aisle. The next, he wasn't. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my brain cycling through possible explanations and rejecting all of them. Eventually, I left the store without buying anything. I walked home in a daze, feeling like I was out of sync with the world, like I'd been dropped into someone else's dream. That's when the dream started. Every night, I'd close my eyes and find myself standing in a place I didn't recognize. A vast, empty city with streets that stretched on forever, twisting and looping in impossible ways. The buildings were tall and faceless, their windows dark, their walls pulsing faintly with light that didn't come from the sun. There were no people, no cars, no signs of life. Just me and the sound of my own footsteps echoing endlessly. Sometimes, I'd hear whispers, faint and indistinct, coming from somewhere just out of sight. I could never understand what they were saying, but they filled me with a deep, bone-deep unease, like they weren't meant for me to hear. The dreams felt more real than they should have, more vivid than any dream I'd ever had before. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the details already fading from my mind. But one thing stayed with me, the feeling that the city wasn't just a dream. It was a real place, and I was being pulled toward it, whether I wanted to go or not. The flickers got worse after that. It wasn't just people anymore. It was objects, moments, entire stretches of time. I'd pour myself a cup of coffee and turn around to find the mug still sitting on the counter, empty. I'd check the time on my phone, and 5 minutes later, the clock would read the exact same as before. Once, I got off the subway and found myself standing back on the train platform as if I'd never boarded in the first place. I started avoiding mirrors because I didn't trust the reflection to move the way it was supposed to. I tried to ignore it, to push through my days as if everything was fine. But then, 3 nights ago, I saw her. I was on my way home, cutting through the park again. It was dark, but the moon was bright enough to light the path. That's when I noticed someone walking ahead of me, a woman in a yellow raincoat. Something about her seemed familiar, though I couldn't place her at first. She moved quickly, her head down, her hands buried in her pockets. As I got closer, I realized why she looked familiar. She was me. The raincoat was the same one hanging in my closet, the one I'd bought on a whim last spring. Her hair was the same length as mine, the same color. Even the way she walked, the slight sway in her step, the way her shoulders hunched forward, was identical. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. She didn't turn around. She just kept walking, disappearing around a bend in the path. I stood there, frozen, until the sound of footsteps came from behind me. I spun around, half expecting to see her again, but there was no one there. Just the empty path and the rustle of leaves in the wind. I ran the rest of the way home. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring out at the street below, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The city carried on as usual, oblivious to the cracks forming in its fabric. This morning, I woke up to find a piece of paper on my kitchen table. I don't know how it got there. I hadn't let anyone into my apartment, and the door was still locked from the inside. The paper was folded neatly, with a single word written on the outside, soon. I unfolded it with trembling hands, half expecting it to be blank, but it wasn't. There was a map drawn on the page, rough and uneven, like it had been sketched in a hurry. It showed a street I didn't recognize, ending at what looked like a building. Beside the building, there was a single phrase scrawled in shaky handwriting. "The clock doesn't stop here." I don't know what it means, but I think I have to find out. If the flickers are getting stronger, if the cracks in the world are spreading, then maybe I'm not just imagining things. Maybe the city in my dreams is real. Maybe it's waiting for me. The map is still sitting on my table. I'm staring at it now, trying to decide if I should follow it. Part of me is terrified. The other part of me is more afraid of what will happen if I don't. The clock doesn't stop here. Maybe it never does. I moved into this apartment 2 years ago, and for the first 6 months, I didn't notice the cabinet. It's not exactly hidden. It's right there, in the corner of the kitchen, tucked above the fridge. One of those awkward little cabinets that no one uses because it's too high up and inconvenient to reach. You need a step stool, or maybe a chair, and let's be honest, no one wants to risk a broken ankle just to grab a pan they haven't used in a decade. So it sat there, unbothered, collecting dust and the occasional cobweb, while I lived my life without giving it a second thought. Until one day, for no reason at all, I did. I looked up from my coffee and thought, what's even in there? It wasn't a pressing question, more of a passing curiosity, the kind of idle thought you have when you're procrastinating on something else. But the thought stuck. For the next few days, I couldn't stop wondering. I'd walk into the kitchen to make a sandwich or pour some water, and my eyes would drift to the cabinet. I started coming up with increasingly elaborate theories about its contents. Forgotten family heirlooms, a nest of spiders, the Ark of the Covenant, minus the face-melting powers. Part of me knew it was probably empty, but part of me also knew I wouldn't be able to let it go until I found out for sure. The first problem was access. I didn't own a step stool, and my kitchen chairs wobbled ominously whenever I so much as leaned on them. For a brief moment, I considered stacking a couple of shoeboxes to use as makeshift steps, but the mental image of me toppling over and breaking my neck was enough to nix that plan. So I borrowed a stool from my neighbor, an older woman named Rita who lives across the hall and always smells faintly of cinnamon. She raised an eyebrow when I asked for it, but didn't press me for details. "Just bring it back when you're done," she said, handing it over like she was indulging a child. That evening, I set up the stool in front of the fridge and climbed up, careful to distribute my weight evenly on the narrow surface. Up close, the cabinet looked even dustier than I'd expected. I ran my finger along the edge, leaving a trail like a chalkboard swipe, and felt a strange combination of anticipation and unease. Then I reached for the handle, twisted it, and pulled the door open. At first, I thought it was empty. The cabinet was deep, and the light from the kitchen barely reached the back. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw something. A small, nondescript cardboard box, pushed all the way to the far corner. I hesitated. There was no reason to believe the box contained anything important, but there was also no reason to believe it didn't. I reached in, fingers brushing against rough cardboard, and pulled it out. It was heavier than I expected. I climbed down from the stool and placed the box on the counter, staring at it like it might explode. It was sealed with brittle packing tape, yellowed at the edges, and there was no writing on the outside. No address, no labels, nothing to suggest where it had come from or why it was there. For a moment, I considered just putting it back. Whatever was inside had clearly been forgotten, and maybe it was better to leave it that way. But curiosity has a way of digging in and not letting go. I grabbed a butter knife and carefully sliced through the tape. The first thing I saw was a bundle of papers. They were folded and crammed into the box in no particular order, the edges soft and slightly discolored, like they'd been handled too many times. I pulled one out and unfolded it. It was a letter, handwritten in neat, slanted cursive. The ink had faded, but I could still make out the words, "Dear Lila, I hope this finds you well. It's been so long since we last spoke." I read the rest of the letter, my heart beating faster with every line. It wasn't a love letter, exactly, but there was a tenderness to it that made me feel like I was intruding on something private. The writer, someone named Marcus, talked about missing Lila's voice, about how the city felt emptier without her. The letter ended with a plea. "Please write back. I just want to know how you're doing." I set the letter aside and pulled out another. This one was shorter, and the tone was sharper, almost desperate. "Why haven't you written back? I don't understand what happened. Did I do something wrong? The more I read, the more it felt like I was piecing together a story, though it was a story full of holes. There was no context, no explanation of who these people were or what their relationship had been, just fragments of longing and confusion, preserved in shaky handwriting on thin paper. Underneath the letters, there were other things. A photograph, black and white and slightly blurred, of a woman sitting on a park bench. She had her head tilted back, laughing at something outside the frame. A pressed flower, its petals brittle and faded to a soft beige. A small tin box, the kind you might use to store coins, containing a single key. I held the key in my hand, turning it over, but there was nothing remarkable about it. Just an ordinary key, with no clue as to what it might unlock. By the time I reached the bottom of the box, my counter was covered in its contents, and my head was spinning with questions. Who was Lila? Who was Marcus? Why had their story ended up in my cabinet, of all places? I wanted to believe it was some grand mystery, but the more likely explanation was that it had belonged to a previous tenant. Someone who'd moved out in a hurry and forgotten it. Someone who'd left their past behind and never looked back. I thought about trying to track them down. Maybe there was a way to return the box to its rightful owner, to give them back this piece of their history. But the truth is, I didn't even know where to start. The letters didn't include any addresses or last names, and the photo didn't offer any clues. It was as if the box had been designed to exist in isolation, a little time capsule with no ties to the outside world. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Lila and Marcus, imagining their lives, their arguments, their silences. I wondered if Marcus ever got his reply. I wondered if Lila ever read his letters. And I wondered why, out of all the places in the world, their story had ended up with me. It felt like an accident, but also like a responsibility. Like I'd been given something fragile and important, and I didn't know what to do with it. In the end, I put everything back in the box and returned it to the cabinet. It felt like the right thing to do, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe some mysteries are meant to stay unresolved. Maybe the box wasn't meant to be solved, but simply discovered, briefly held, and then left alone. It's still there now, sitting above the fridge, quietly existing in its own corner of the universe. Sometimes I think about taking it out again, going through the letters one more time, trying to piece together the fragments of Marcus and Lila's story. But I never do. Instead, I let it sit, gathering dust, waiting for the next person to find it. Because maybe that's the point. Maybe the box isn't about the past at all. Maybe it's about the future. About the people who will come after me, who will open the cabinet and wonder, what's even in there? So now I have to ask, have you ever stumbled across something that didn't belong to you? Something that felt like it carried a story too big to be explained? And what did you do with it? The first time I saw the man, he was standing on the roof of the old shoe factory at the edge of town, holding an umbrella that was much too small to do him any good. The umbrella was bright yellow, the kind of color that makes you look twice even when you don't mean to, and it stood out sharply against the peeling gray brick of the factory and the pale sky behind it. I was on my way to the grocery store, walking the long way because I'd needed to clear my head, and I almost didn't notice him. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring out over the empty parking lot like it was a stage, and he was the only performer. I slowed to a stop, trying to make sense of it. The factory had been shut down for years, boarded up and left to crumble. No one went there, not even the kids who tagged their initials on every available surface in town. I thought about calling out to him, but something held me back. He didn't seem dangerous exactly, but he didn't seem entirely real either. There was something about the way he stood, completely still, as if the world around him didn't exist. Then he tilted the umbrella slightly, as if to test whether the wind would take it, and I walked away. I didn't think about him much after that. I figured he was just some eccentric drifter passing through, the kind of person you might mention in a story at a party years later if the conversation needed a strange detail. But a week later, on another aimless walk, I saw him again. This time, he was standing on the roof of the public library downtown. The same yellow umbrella, the same stillness, like a statue planted on the edge of the building. It wasn't raining, though the clouds looked heavy, the kind that could break open at any moment. I stayed longer this time, watching from across the street. People passed by without looking up, completely unaware. The world moved on around him like he wasn't there, but I couldn't stop staring. After a few minutes, I called out, "Hey," just to see what would happen. He didn't flinch, didn't turn, didn't even glance in my direction. I thought about going inside the library, trying to find a way up to the roof, but I hesitated too long. When I looked up again, he was gone. It became a pattern. Every few days, I'd spot him somewhere new, always on a roof, always with the same umbrella. The fire station, the movie theater, the high school gymnasium. It was never the same time of day, and he was never there for more than a few minutes before disappearing like smoke. I started carrying binoculars in my bag, pretending it was just a harmless quirk. But deep down, I was obsessed. Who was he? Why was he there? And why did no one else seem to notice? One evening, I was sitting on the swings at the park, the kind of aimless stop I made when I didn't want to go home yet. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold, and the park was almost empty. That's when I saw him again, perched on the roof of the maintenance shed like a bird. The umbrella was closed this time, resting against his shoulder, but the bright yellow stood out like a flare against the fading light. I didn't hesitate this time. I stood up and started walking toward the shed, my heart pounding harder with every step. As I got closer, I realized the shed wasn't as tall as I'd thought. If I stood on the picnic table nearby, I could probably climb onto the roof. For the first time, the distance between us didn't feel insurmountable. He didn't move as I approached, didn't acknowledge me at all. I climbed onto the picnic table, gripping the edge of the roof and pulling myself up awkwardly, my palms scraping against the rough shingles. When I finally stood on the roof, catching my breath, he was there, just a few feet away, staring out at the empty park like I wasn't even there. "Who are you?" I asked. My voice sounded small, swallowed up by the open air. He didn't answer. Up close, I could see that his suit, yes, he was wearing a suit, was fraying at the cuffs and elbows, and his shoes were scuffed like he'd been walking a long, long time. His face was pale and clean-shaven, almost too smooth, like a mannequin that had come to life. But his eyes were something else entirely, sharp, clear, and so dark they seemed to drink in the light. "Why do you keep showing up everywhere?" I pressed. "What are you doing up here?" He turned his head slowly, and for the first time, he looked at me. His gaze was steady, unblinking, and I felt a strange tug in my chest, like he was pulling something out of me just by looking. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried like thunder in the stillness. "Do you see them?" he asked. "See what?" I said, confused. He raised the umbrella, pointing it toward the horizon, where the park ended and the trees began. At first, I saw nothing, just the fading sunlight filtering through the leaves. But then, slowly, shapes began to emerge. Figures, moving silently through the trees. They weren't walking exactly. It was more like they were gliding, their movements too smooth to be human. Their forms were shadowy and indistinct, but there was something about them that made my skin crawl. I realized I was holding my breath. What are they?" I whispered. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the umbrella fall to his side, gripping it tightly as if it were the only thing tethering him to the roof. "They're always there," he said finally. "Most people can't see them, but you can. That's why I stayed." I wanted to ask what he meant, but the words caught in my throat. The figures in the trees were moving closer now, their shapes becoming clearer. They didn't have faces, just smooth, featureless ovals where eyes and mouths should have been. My pulse was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. "What do they want?" I managed to choke out. He turned back to me, his expression unreadable. "They don't want anything," he said. "They just are. And if you can see them, they'll see you too." I stumbled backward, almost slipping off the roof. The figures were at the edge of the park now, their presence heavy, like the weight of an oncoming storm. I didn't want to look at them, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man stepped closer, closing the umbrella with a sharp snap. "You leave," he said simply, "and you don't look back." I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I climbed down from the roof as fast as I could, nearly twisting my ankle as I hit the ground. The air felt thicker now, harder to breathe, and the shadows in the park seemed to stretch toward me as I ran. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, the streetlights buzzing overhead like a lifeline. When I finally turned around, the park was empty. No shadows, no figures, no man with an umbrella, just silence. I never saw him again after that. The rooftops stayed empty, the park stayed quiet, and life went on. But sometimes, when I walk past the trees at night, I catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. Just a flicker, a shape that vanishes as soon as I turn my head. And every time, I hear his voice in my mind. They'll see you too. Have you ever caught sight of something you weren't supposed to see? Something that changed the way you looked at the world forever? The mirror was not supposed to be there. When I first moved into the apartment, it had been empty, stripped bare like the bones of some long-forgotten animal. I'd signed the lease for the cheap rent, for the cracked crown molding that gave the place a ghost of charm, for the way the sunlight came through the warped windows at just the right angle in the mornings. But no furniture, no decorations, nothing. So when I came home that Friday night, juggling my keys and a bag of takeout, I almost dropped everything at the sight of the mirror leaning casually against the wall in my hallway, as if it had always been there. It wasn't small. It wasn't something you could dismiss with a shrug and a must have been left behind. It was massive, almost 7 feet tall, with an ornately carved wooden frame that curled and twisted like ivy grown wild. The wood looked ancient, not in a falling apart kind of way, but like it belonged in a castle or maybe a museum. Deeply stained, polished to a shine, every curve impossibly intricate. I stood there for a long moment, frozen in my doorway, staring at it. There was no note, no sign of how it had gotten there. Just its looming presence, taking up half the hallway and reflecting me back in sharp detail. My first instinct was to call my landlord, but it was already past 10, and the thought of navigating his usual cocktail of incompetence and gruff dismissal made me sigh. I set down my bag and walked over to inspect the thing, running my fingers along the smooth, cold wood. The surface of the mirror itself was flawless, clearer than any glass I'd ever seen. Too clear, almost. I leaned in, peering at my reflection, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something move behind me. Not in the hallway, but in the mirror. Just a flicker, a shadow, gone so quickly I could have convinced myself it was a trick of the light. I stepped back, shaking my head. I'd had a long day, long enough to make a random mirror in my hallway feel ominous when it was probably just misplaced. A neighbor's delivery gone wrong. Or maybe someone in the building had stuck it here temporarily, too lazy to carry it up the stairs. That thought made sense, or at least enough sense that I decided not to think about it anymore. I turned off the lights and went to bed, and by the time I woke up the next morning, I'd nearly forgotten about it, until I opened my bedroom door and saw the mirror again. Only now, it wasn't in the hallway. It was in the living room. I stopped mid-step, my pulse quickening. The mirror was leaning against the wall opposite my couch, exactly where I would have put it if I'd been the one moving it. But I hadn't. My door had been locked all night, and I lived alone. The thought that someone had been in my apartment made my stomach drop. I checked the locks, the windows, every possible point of entry, but there was nothing. No sign of forced entry, no muddy footprints, no scuff marks on the floor from where the mirror had been moved. Just me and my empty apartment and the mirror, standing there like it belonged. I didn't touch it this time. I just stood in front of it, staring at my reflection, which stared back at me in perfect clarity. Too perfect. The light in the room seemed different in the mirror. Sharper, colder. The colors of the furniture behind me were just a little off, as though they'd been painted with a brush dipped in water too many times. And then, for the second time, I saw something move. It wasn't behind me. It was in the mirror. At first, it was just a ripple, like someone had run their hand along the surface of the glass. Then it was a shape, a figure, distant and blurred, moving in the background where there shouldn't have been anything but my beige couch. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming at me to look away, to run, but I couldn't. The figure grew clearer, stepping closer, until I could see it fully. It was me, not my reflection, me, standing in the space behind the reflection of my couch, where there was nothing but empty wall in the real world. The other me was identical, down to the way my hair fell over my shoulder, the tiny scar above my eyebrow, the faded band logo on my sweatshirt. But her expression was different. Blank. Calm. Too calm. She tilted her head slightly, studying me the way you might study a bug you weren't sure you wanted to squash. Then she raised her hand, and for one horrible moment, I thought she was going to reach out of the mirror. Instead, she pointed at me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug, and the motion snapped me out of whatever trance I'd been in. I turned and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me like it would do anything to keep the thing in the mirror contained. My breath came in shallow gasps as I leaned against the wall, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I don't know how long I stayed there, too afraid to move. When I finally opened the door again, the mirror was gone. The relief that swept through me was almost enough to make me laugh. Almost. The living room was empty, the couch exactly where it should have been, the walls bare except for the cheap prints I'd hung when I moved in. I even checked the hallway, just to be sure, but there was nothing. I thought about calling someone. My landlord, the police, Naomi, my best friend who always knew what to say when I was spiraling. But what would I tell them? That a mirror had appeared in my apartment and then disappeared like it had never existed? That I'd seen myself inside it, pointing at me like I was the stranger? I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself it had been a dream, or maybe some bizarre hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But that night, as I lay in bed with the lights off and my heart refusing to settle, I heard it. A soft creak, the sound of wood pressing against wood. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen in place, my breath shallow and ragged, as the creaking grew louder, closer, until it was right outside my bedroom door. The door didn't open. Nothing came inside. But I knew, in the pit of my stomach, that the mirror was out there, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed awake that night, staring at the thin line of light under the door, expecting to see the shadow of feet. But the door stayed shut, and eventually, exhaustion took me. In the morning, the mirror was back in the hallway. I didn't approach it this time. I didn't touch it. I didn't look too closely at my reflection, afraid of what I might see. Instead, I left. I grabbed my keys and my phone and walked out the door without even putting on proper shoes, leaving the mirror and the apartment and everything inside it behind. I haven't gone back. I won't. My landlord has called a dozen times, asking why I'm not answering the door, but I don't pick up. The thought of trying to explain feels impossible, but I've started seeing reflections in places they don't belong. In the window of a bus, the surface of a puddle, the curve of a spoon. Always fleeting, always faint, but always me. Watching, waiting. And sometimes, when I look long enough, I see her raise her hand again, pointing. I met Theo on a day when everything in my life was so absurdly awful that I could only laugh at how doomed it all felt. My car had died in the middle of an intersection during rush hour, smoke pouring out of the hood like it had just lost a fight with a dragon. My phone, naturally, had decided that this was the perfect moment to stop holding a charge, so calling for help wasn't an option. To top it off, the weather, which had been sunny all morning, took an unexpected and dramatic turn, dumping a torrent of rain onto the world as if the sky itself was weeping for me. I stood there in the rain, soaked to the bone, waving half-heartedly at the endless stream of cars zipping by and honking at me like I'd deliberately chosen to ruin their day. I was cold, wet, and furious, my breath fogging up the air as I muttered a string of curses that grew more colorful with each passing second. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of a bike bell, two cheerful little dings that felt comically out of place amid the chaos. I turned and saw Theo riding toward me on the most ridiculous bicycle I'd ever seen. It was bright yellow, with a basket in the front filled with what looked like apples and a small radio duct-taped to the handlebars, playing an old jazz tune that sounded like it belonged in a speakeasy. Theo himself was equally outlandish. He wore a raincoat so oversized it looked like it had been stolen from a giant, a pair of round sunglasses despite the storm, and a knit beanie that was somehow managing to stay perched on his head despite the wind. He looked like someone who had wandered straight out of a children's storybook. "You look like you're about 2 seconds away from punching a cloud," he said, braking to a stop beside me and tilting his sunglasses down just enough to reveal a pair of striking green eyes. I stared at him, too caught off guard to respond. "Do you need help, or are you planning to yell at the rain until it apologizes?" he asked, his tone so casual that I couldn't tell if he was joking or genuinely curious. "My car's dead," I said finally, gesturing at the smoking vehicle like it was a wounded animal. "I can see that," he said, hopping off his bike and leaning it against a lamppost. "Lucky for you. I'm an expert in vehicular resurrection." "You're a mechanic?" "Not even a little," he replied, grinning as he popped the hood of my car. I should have been worried, alarmed, even, that this stranger had decided to take charge of my disastrous situation. But there was something about the way he moved, so confident and unhurried, that made me pause. He fiddled with something under the hood, muttering to himself about smoke monsters and engine gremlins, and before I knew it, the car sputtered to life like it had been jolted awake from a bad dream. "There we go," he said, wiping his hands on his raincoat with absolutely no regard for the grease stains. "She's alive. How did you? What did you? Wait, what?" I stammered, trying to process what had just happened. He shrugged. "Sometimes, things just need a little persuasion." I wanted to ask him what kind of persuasion involved duct tape and a shoelace, but before I could, he grabbed an apple from his basket and handed it to me. "For your troubles," he said with a wink. "Now go forth and conquer. Or, drive home." And just like that, he was back on his bike, pedaling away as if fixing a stranger's car in the pouring rain was just another Tuesday for him. I didn't expect to see him again, but of course, the universe had other plans. 2 weeks later, I walked into my favorite used bookstore, a cozy little place that smelled like old paper and endless possibilities. And there he was, sitting cross-legged on the floor in the philosophy section, flipping through a book with a title I couldn't pronounce. He looked up as the bell over the door chimed, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "Hey, it's Smokey Carr," he said, waving at me like we were lifelong friends. "It's, Maya," I said, awkwardly waving back. "Maya, right. I'm Theo." He closed the book and stood up, brushing imaginary dust off his jeans. "What brings you to the land of dusty wisdom?" "Books," I said, holding up my tote bag as if I needed to justify my presence in a bookstore. "Solid choice," he said approvingly. "Anything specific, or are you letting fate decide?" "I usually just wander until something catches my eye," I admitted. "Ah, the serendipity approach. Respect." He followed me as I browsed, offering unsolicited and wildly unhelpful commentary on every book I picked up. When I grabbed a collection of essays on existentialism, he nodded sagely and said, "Ah, yes, the perfect book for pondering the void while eating cereal at 2 a.m. When I reached for a sci-fi novel, he gasped and declared, "Bold choice. Do you dare to trust a book with a spaceship on the cover?" By the time I left the store, I wasn't entirely sure if I'd been charmed or harassed. Probably both. Theo started showing up in my life after that, popping up in places where I least expected him. One day, I found him at the farmer's market, juggling oranges while a small crowd cheered him on. Another time, he was sitting on a park bench, teaching a very confused pigeon how to eat sunflower seeds from his palm. Once, I spotted him in a cafe, balancing a spoon on his nose while the barista tried very hard not to laugh. He was everywhere, and yet he never felt intrusive. In fact, it was the opposite. Theo had a way of making every moment feel like an adventure, even if it was something as mundane as picking out potatoes or waiting for the bus. One evening, he invited me to what he called a rooftop picnic. I wasn't sure what to expect, but when I climbed the fire escape of his apartment building, I found him sitting on an old quilt, surrounded by mismatched lanterns and a spread of snacks that included an entire loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a bag of marshmallows. "This is a picnic?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Of course," he said, gesturing grandly at the scene. "We've got food, ambience, and a killer view of the city. What more could you want?" As it turned out, he was right. The view was stunning, the makeshift meal was surprisingly delicious, and Theo's endless stream of stories. From the time he accidentally entered a dance competition in Italy to his brief stint as a dog walker for a psychic. made the whole evening unforgettable. That night, as we sat under the stars, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet. I liked having Theo around. He was unpredictable and a little chaotic, but he made the world feel brighter, like anything was possible as long as you didn't take it too seriously. Months later, Theo is still a constant presence in my life. He doesn't just show up. He arrives, bringing with him a whirlwind of absurdity and joy. He's the kind of person who can turn a dead car, a rainy day, or even a dented apple into an unforgettable story. And somehow, without even trying, he's taught me to see the world the way he does, as a playground full of surprises, waiting to be explored. Have you ever met someone who felt like they were a walking reminder that life is meant to be lived, not just endured? Because that's Theo, and I'm endlessly glad I stopped to notice him.